The moment they called her name, every champagne glass in that gilded ballroom froze in midair. 300 of America's wealthiest, most powerful people, the ones who had spent the entire evening whispering about her, mocking her, treating her like she'd wandered in from the catering staff, turned in stunned silence toward the woman standing in the spotlight. Not as a servant, not as an assistant, not as someone else's accessory, as the most significant philanthropist in the room. And Adrien Vale, the billionaire who had brought her there, felt his entire understanding of power shatter and rebuild itself in a single breath. If you want to see what happens when the people who dismiss you are forced to finally see you stay with me until the very end, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The city never slept, but sometimes on nights like this, it felt like it was breathing just for him. Adrien Vale stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office 60 stories above the Manhattan skyline and pressed his palm flat against the cold glass. Below him, 10,000 lights pulsed and flickered in the darkness. Each one represented something he no longer had the language to name. A dinner table. A conversation that mattered. Someone who remembered your birthday, not because their assistant had flagged it in a calendar notification, but because they actually cared. He was worth $8 billion. He had never felt poorer in his life. The Grayson proposal is ready for your signature. He turned. Maris Bennett stood in the doorway to his office, tablet in hand, expression professionally neutral, in that particular way she'd perfected, composed without being cold, efficient without being robotic. She'd been his executive assistant for 3 years, longer than anyone else had lasted in the role, longer honestly than most of his professional relationships had survived. "It's past 8, Adrien said. "You should have gone home hours ago." "So should you." She crossed the room, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor, and set the tablet on his desk. "But we both know you won't sign anything without reading every page, and the Grayson people need an answer by midnight." He accepted the tablet, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. The contact was so ordinary he almost didn't notice it. Almost. "You don't have to stay," he said. "I'm aware." Maris settled into the chair across from his desk, producing her own tablet with the quiet efficiency of someone who had long since stopped waiting for permission to make herself comfortable. "I have other work to catch up on anyway." This was their routine. The office would empty, assistants and analysts and vice presidents all filtering out into the evening, and the two of them would remain, working in silence that was surprisingly comfortable, broken occasionally by questions or observations or the soft sound of rain against the windows. Adrien had told himself for a long time that it was simply professional dedication on both their parts. Standing here tonight watching her work in the amber light of the desk lamp, he found that explanation increasingly difficult to sustain. "The Harrington Gala is in 2 weeks," he said, setting down the tablet without really looking at it. "I'll contact the agency," Maris replied without looking up. "They have several appropriate options." "No." The word came out sharper than he intended. Maris looked up. "I don't want an escort," Adrien said, hearing how the words sounded even as he spoke them. "I want—" He paused, rearranged. "Would you consider going with me as my guest, not as staff?" The silence that followed was different from their usual comfortable quiet. This one had edges. Maris set down her tablet and studied him with the particular intensity she reserved for problems that didn't have obvious solutions. It was the same look she gave corporate contracts that had landmines buried in the fine print. "Why?" she asked. The honest answer: because I'm tired of performing for people who don't actually see me, and you're the only person in my life who does, sat in his chest like something he hadn't earned the right to say yet. "Because every event I attend feels like theater," he said instead. "Because I have 100 acquaintances and not a single conversation worth having. Because you're the only person I can actually talk to." He exhaled. "Because I'm tired of being alone in crowds." Maris leaned back in her chair. Her fingers drummed once against the tablet, a rare tell one he'd learned to recognize over 3 years of observation. She was genuinely considering something. "You understand what that would look like," she said carefully. "Your social circle isn't exactly known for progressive thinking. An assistant at the Harrington Gala would be, 'I don't care what it looks like.'" "You should." Her tone was even, but something moved in her expression, something unguarded and real. It would reflect on you, yes, but it would also reflect on me. People would question your judgment, and they would absolutely eviscerate me. That's not paranoia, Adrien. That's pattern recognition. He moved to the windows, needing the distance to organize his thoughts. I've survived hostile takeovers, a congressional investigation, a Forbes cover story that got half my biography wrong. I think I can handle some gossip from people whose greatest accomplishment is inheriting money. This isn't about business. Her voice carried a note he rarely heard from her, caution, layered over something that might have been vulnerability. This is about your social standing in circles that control board seats, investment partnerships, political influence. The Harrington Gala isn't just a party. It's where power reinforces itself. Then maybe it's time that power was challenged. The room was quiet for a long moment. Outside, 60 floors below, the city moved on without them. "You're serious about this," Maris said finally. It wasn't quite a question. "I am. And you've considered how it will affect me." She stood smoothing her skirt, a gesture he recognized as her buying time. "Being dragged into scrutiny, I've carefully avoided for 3 years." Adrien turned to face her fully. "I won't force you. If you say no, we never mention it again. Nothing changes." He paused, choosing his next words with the care he usually reserved for negotiation. "But if you say yes, you attend as my equal, not my assistant, not my accessory, my guest." Maris crossed to stand beside him at the window, and for a moment they both looked out at the same glittering city from the same altitude, seeing perhaps very different things. "I've spent my entire career making myself invisible," she said quietly. Her voice was different now, stripped of its professional texture, reaching toward something more honest. "Competent, but unobtrusive. Capable, but non-threatening. I learned early that being a woman in corporate spaces means choosing between being respected or being liked, and neither path guarantees advancement. So I chose a third option." She paused. "Being indispensable." "I've noticed," Adrien said. "Most people don't." She glanced at him sideways. "Most people see the title executive assistant and mentally file me under furniture. They talk freely around me because they've forgotten I'm human. They dismiss my intelligence because my job is to make their lives easier. And I've let them because invisibility is its own kind of power. And I'm asking you to give it up. You're asking me to step into a spotlight I've been deliberately avoiding." Maris turned fully toward him, and in the pale light from the windows, her expression was extraordinarily clear. Not angry, not afraid, but deeply, carefully honest. "The Harrington Gala has 300 of the wealthiest, most connected people in the country. If I attend as your guest, every single one of them will dissect me, my background, my education, my wardrobe, my lineage. They'll look for reasons to dismiss me, and they'll find them because they need me to be dismissible. It validates their worldview. And if you don't care about their validation—" She was quiet for a moment. Then something shifted at the corners of her mouth, not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to one. "I'd be lying if I said rejection didn't sting, even when it comes from people whose approval I don't want. I'm human, Adrien. That doesn't change. So you're saying no?" "I'm saying—" She paused, and when she continued, her voice carried something that sounded almost like decision. "I'm saying I've never built my life around other people's comfort, and I find myself curious what would happen if I stopped hiding." Adrien felt his pulse quicken. "Is that a yes?" "It's a maybe." The ghost of a smile became real. "Let me sleep on it. This isn't a decision to make at 8:30 on a Tuesday night while we're both exhausted." "Fair enough." She moved toward the door, then paused with her hand on the frame. "Adrien." She looked back at him across the length of his office, across the amber light and the cold glass and the weight of everything unsaid between them. "Why does this actually matter to you, not the social statement, not the challenge to hierarchy, the real reason?" He considered deflecting. There were good deflections available: strategic narrative disrupting stagnant social structures, any number of things that would sound intelligent and feel safe. But Maris had always demanded honesty. She could hear the difference between what you meant and what you were willing to say, and she never pretended she couldn't. "Because I'm tired of being alone in crowds," he said. "And you're the only person who makes me feel less alone." She held his gaze across the room for a long, still moment. In her expression, he watched something shift, some wall precisely maintained, showing the first hairline crack. "I'll give you an answer tomorrow," she said softly. She left. Adrien turned back to the windows, and the city glittered on below him, indifferent to the fact that he'd just said the truest thing he'd said in years. The next morning, he arrived at the office to find her already at her desk. Charcoal suit coffee-ready schedule reviewed the ordinary architecture of their professional life assembled and waiting. She handed him his coffee without looking up. "Good morning. You have a 9 o'clock with legal lunch with Senator Michaels and the board meeting at 3. She paused a single beat. "And yes." He stopped walking. "Yes," she repeated, finally looking at him. Her eyes were steady, her expression composed, but there was something underneath it that he hadn't seen before or perhaps hadn't let himself recognize. "I'll attend the gala with you, as your guest." Adrien felt something loosen in his chest, something he hadn't realized had been wound tight. "You're sure? I'm curious what happens when I stop playing it safe." She returned to her keyboard. "I reserve the right to say I told you so when your friends treat me like I wandered in from the catering staff." "They're not my friends." Maris arched an eyebrow without looking up. "Then what are they?" He thought about it honestly. Richard Ashford, who'd inherited 3 companies and run 2 into the ground. The Vandermeers with their old money contempt for anyone who'd earned rather than inherited their position. Vivienne Lassier, whose idea of hardship was a table at a restaurant with a 3-month wait. "Occupational hazards," he said finally. "Well," she almost smiled. "Let's see how they handle the unexpected." The call started within 48 hours. Richard Ashford was first catching Adrien between meetings with the practiced timing of a man who'd spent decades leveraging inconvenience. "Tell me it's not true," Richard said, his voice carrying that particular blend of concern and relish that meant he was about to enjoy himself at someone else's expense. "You're not actually bringing your assistant to the Harrington Gala." "I'm bringing Maris Bennett, yes." "Adrien." Richard's tone shifted into something warmer, which somehow made it worse. "I'm trying to help you here. You can't show up to the social event of the season with your secretary. It's professional suicide. What will people think? That I chose interesting company over predictable company? They'll think you couldn't get a real date." Richard laughed, a short, sharp sound. "Come on, man. If you're between relationships, there are services for this. Beautiful, educated women who know how to handle high-profile events. I can make some calls." Adrien felt his jaw tighten. "Maris is beautiful and educated. She's staff Adrien. There's a hierarchy. You're a billionaire CEO. She's..." A pause. "Does she even have a college degree?" "Double major, business and computer science, MIT, graduated summa cum laude." A brief recalibrating postence on the other end. "Well, look, credentials don't matter. It's about optics, perception. You bring an assistant to the Harrington Gala and people will assume you're either making a statement or having some kind of breakdown. Let them assume. I'm trying to save you from embarrassment." Richard's voice hardened slightly. "And her, frankly, do you have any idea what Vivienne alone will do to her? They'll smile and ask pointed questions and make sure she knows exactly where she ranks in the room. It'll be brutal." "Then maybe they should reconsider their behavior." Richard laughed again, different this time, sharper, less amused. "Oh, this is adorable. You think you can change centuries of social order because you have money. These people don't care how many billions you're worth, Adrien. They care about lineage, legacy, who your parents were and where you summered. You're already an outsider who got lucky. Bringing the help to their event just proves you don't understand the rules." "I understand the rules perfectly." Adrien kept his voice very flat. "I just don't respect them." "Then you're going to learn a very expensive lesson." A pause. "But hey, it's your funeral. I'll have a front row seat." The line went dead. Adrien sat in the silence afterward, Richard's words settling into the room like something toxic. The ugly certainty in his voice, the casual assumption that cruelty was not just inevitable, but appropriate. He'd known his social circle was superficial. He hadn't fully grasped until this moment how deeply the viciousness ran. More calls followed. Vivienne left a voicemail dripping with synthetic sweetness. "Darling, I heard the most amusing rumor. Tell me you're not actually bringing your assistant to the gala. Those poor people work so hard. Wouldn't it be cruel to throw her somewhere she'd be so obviously out of place? Marcus Vandermeer sent a text. Dude, what are you thinking? Come alone if you have to. Don't make this weird. Caroline Hartwick, who sat on 3 boards with Adrien, called personally, her voice carrying the tone of someone delivering a medical diagnosis. Adrien, I'm speaking to you as a friend. This is a mistake. The Harrington Gala has standards. Bringing your assistant crosses lines that exist for good reasons. It undermines the entire social structure we've built. Maybe the structure deserves to be undermined. A chilly pause. She's really worth professional isolation. Adrien thought of Maris at her desk that morning, the quiet intelligence in her eyes, the way she treated him like a human being rather than a bank account with a pulse. Yes, he said simply. She is. He told Maris about the calls that evening, half bracing for second thoughts. Instead, she looked at him with the particular expression she reserved for confirming information she'd already calculated. Richard's assistant called fishing for details, she said without looking up from her screen. Vivian's personal shopper contacted me about finding something appropriate for the event. Very subtle. She paused. I assume by appropriate they mean something that doesn't risk outshining the women who spent $50,000 on their gowns. You could spend $50,000 on a gown if you wanted to. I could. A slight smile. I won't. I'm not trying to compete with them. I'm not trying to prove I belong in their world. She looked up, and what he saw in her expression was absolute unassailable clarity. I'm simply attending an event as your guest wearing something elegant that reflects who I am, not who they think I should be. They're going to try to hurt you. I know. She said it without flinching, without performance, just honest acknowledgement. But pain is only effective when you care about the source. I don't need Vivian Lessier's approval. I don't need Richard Ashford to think I'm worthy. She held his gaze. I know my own value. The question is, do you? Yes, he said, without hesitation. Then that's all that matters. She returned to her work, efficiently closing the conversation. But Adrien couldn't move for a moment. He'd spent the week worrying about protecting her, imagining himself as a shield between her and the social venom he knew was coming. It was only now, watching her work with complete grounded serenity, that he understood how deeply he'd misread the situation. Maris Bennett didn't need a shield. She'd been fighting her entire life. The night before the gala, he couldn't sleep. He paced his penthouse, a glass of whiskey untouched on the coffee table, cataloging everything that could go wrong. His phone buzzed just past 11. Maris. Still having second thoughts. He smiled, despite himself. Adrien. How did you know Maris? Because you sent me 3 separate emails today, clarifying details that didn't need clarification. And you went unusually quiet this afternoon. He stared at the phone, then typed, I don't want you to get hurt. The 3 dots appeared and disappeared twice before her response came. Maris, I'm stronger than you think. Adrien, I know you are. That's not the point. Maris. Then what is? He stood at the window for a long moment, watching the city breathe below him, trying to find honest words for something complicated. Adrien, you matter to me, more than I realized until I started imagining what they might say to you. The response took longer this time. He found himself holding his breath in a way that felt ridiculous for a 37-year-old man who had once stared down a hostile congressional subcommittee without blinking. Maris. Then stand beside me tomorrow night and let me handle them. I've been fighting my whole life, Adrien. I know how to survive. Adrien. This isn't about survival. You shouldn't have to fight at all. Maris, no. But I do. And I'm choosing to fight for the right to exist in spaces I've been told I don't belong. That choice matters more than their opinions. He read it 3 times. Then he read it once more slowly, and felt his understanding rearrange itself. He'd been framing this as protection. As his role in the narrative, the powerful man who brings someone in from the outside shields her from the wolves, validates her place in the room. But that framing made her the object of the story rather than its subject. It assumed she needed rescuing. Maybe she didn't need rescuing. Maybe she needed him to trust that she could handle herself and simply to be present while she did. Adrien, I'll be there, right beside you. Maris, good. Now get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be interesting. Adrien, that's one word for it. Maris, I prefer transformative, but we'll see. He set down his phone and returned to the window. The city glittered on below, indifferent, enormous, full of people who would never know that somewhere in this building, a man who'd built an $8 billion company from nothing had just learned something about his own limitations. Tomorrow, the social circle that had always treated him as a tolerated outsider would learn something too, about what it meant to underestimate a woman who had nothing left to prove. The day of the Harrington Gala arrived with perfect autumn weather. Crisp, clear the sky at sunset burning amber, and rose over the skyline like something theatrical. Adrien dressed with the focused care he usually reserved for investor presentations, adjusted his bow tie 3 times, accepted that it was as good as it was going to get. At 6:30, his driver pulled up to Maris's building. The neighborhood was solid, comfortable, entirely unglamorous. No doorman, no marble lobby, no implicit architecture of wealth. Adrien waited in the car, palms damp in a way that felt profoundly undignified, given that he had at various points in his career negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions while eating a vending machine sandwich. The building door opened, and Maris stepped out. She wore a gown the color of deep emerald, sleek, precise, elegant, without announcing itself. Her hair was swept up, revealing the clean line of her neck. The jewelry was minimal, small diamond earrings that caught the streetlight and released it again without demanding attention. She looked like herself. Not like a woman performing sophistication she didn't own, but like a woman who decided to let the world see who she actually was. It was somehow more powerful than anything he'd seen inside the most exclusive rooms in the country. Adrien got out of the car to meet her. "You look beautiful," he said, and meant it in a way that had nothing to do with the gown or the lighting or any other quantifiable element. "You look terrified," Maris replied, the corner of her mouth lifting. "I'm not terrified. He paused. "Honest." "Okay. I'm a little terrified." "Of them or for me?" "Both." Maris took his arm. "Then let's go remind them that power comes in forms they don't recognize." They settled into the car, and as the city slid past the windows, Adrien became acutely aware of her presence in a way that felt new, not the familiar awareness of a colleague, but something more exposed. The subtle scent of her perfume, the quiet steadiness radiating from her stillness. "Thank you," he said as they merged into traffic, "for agreeing to this." "Thank me later," Maris replied, "after we see whether I survive the night." "You'll survive." "I know." She looked at him, something glinting in her dark eyes that might have been anticipation. "The question is whether they will." He laughed, a real laugh, the kind that loosened the knot that had been living in his chest for days. Whatever happened tonight, at least he wouldn't face it alone. The Harrington estate appeared at the curve of the private drive, its windows blazing with warm light music drifting through the open doors into the autumn evening. A parade of black cars deposited women in designed gowns and men in custom tuxedos onto a marble entrance walk lined with perfectly sculpted hedgerows. Valets moved with trained efficiency. The whole scene had the quality of an elaborate stage set, beautiful, expensive, and designed to communicate a single message to anyone who entered: "You are only here because we allow it." Adrien felt Maris's hand tighten slightly on his arm as they approached. Just once. Then her grip relaxed, her chin lifted fractionally, and she walked forward with the same calm authority she brought to his office every morning, not performing confidence, having it. They had barely crossed the threshold when Vivienne Lassier materialized from the crowd, her Dior gown shimmering like poured gold, her smile sharp enough to leave marks. "Well," Vivienne said, air-kissing Adrien's cheeks with practiced precision before turning the full voltage of her attention on Maris. "This must be the famous assistant everyone's been talking about." "Maris Bennett." Maris extended her hand with unhurried professionalism. "It's nice to meet you, Miss Lassier. I've read about your philanthropic work. The children's literacy program you launched last year seems particularly effective." Vivienne's smile flickered. She'd clearly arrived with a script and Maris had just ignored it entirely. How informed of you, Vivian managed. And what a lovely dress. Vintage? Contemporary? Maris replied pleasantly. I prefer classic lines to trendy statements. They age better. The implication settled over the room like perfume that Vivian's aggressively modern gown might look embarrassingly dated in 6 months. Vivian's eyes narrowed to the precise degree that still allowed her to claim she was smiling. How refreshing, she said, her tone suggesting the opposite. Adrien, darling, you must introduce your guests to the Vandermeers. They're holding court by the terrace. I'm sure they'd be fascinated to meet someone from such a different background. She drifted away in a cloud of expensive perfume and calculated malice. Round 1, Maris murmured. Still breathing? Adrien asked quietly. She implied your dress came from a thrift store. I caught that. I implied her fashion choices lack longevity. A composed sip of champagne from a passing server's tray. We're even. He studied her profile in the flickering candlelight. She wasn't performing composure. She genuinely wasn't threatened. She was, he realized, with something between awe and vertigo, watching these people the way a scientist watches specimens, curious about their behavior, but fundamentally unmoved by their judgment. The realization rearranged something in his understanding. Marcus Vandermeer reached them before they could move, accompanied by his wife Claudia, in pearls that probably cost more than most people's mortgages. Adrien, Marcus clapped him on the shoulder with false heartiness. We were beginning to think you'd changed your mind about coming. Just fashionably late. Adrien kept his smile easy. Marcus, Claudia, this is Maris Bennett. Charmed, Claudia said, her eyes performing a rapid clinical assessment of Maris that she clearly didn't bother to disguise. Bennett, is that English? Are you from the Massachusetts Bennetts or the Philadelphia line? Neither, Maris said. My family's from the Midwest. No notable lineage unless you count my great-grandfather who invented a particularly efficient farming implement. The silence that followed was extraordinary. Claudia's smile froze in place, unable to determine whether she'd been gently mocked or whether this woman was genuinely claiming agricultural equipment as her heritage. How industrious, Marcus said finally. And you work for Adrien, is that right? I do. Must be fascinating, getting an inside look at how real business operates. His condescension was barely veiled. So different from the corporate structures most of us deal with. Adrien's very hands-on, I understand. Very self-made. The emphasis on self-made carried the weight of an insult, a reminder that Adrien hadn't been born to this, that neither of them belonged here the way the Vandermeers felt they did. He is, Maris agreed pleasantly. It's remarkable what people accomplish when they rely on intelligence and innovation rather than inherited capital and stagnant business models. Adrien coughed to cover a laugh. Claudia's expression went glacial. We should circulate, she said, ice crystallizing visibly in her voice. So many important people to greet. I'm sure you understand, Adrien, some conversations require a certain level of relevance. They glided away. You just called their entire existence stagnant, Adrien said very quietly. I called their business model stagnant, Maris corrected. But if they'd like to take it personally, that's their prerogative. They're going to come after you harder now. Good. Something flashed in her eyes, not anger, but something more controlled, colder. I'd rather they attack directly than smile while plotting. At least then we know where everyone stands. Around them, the Harrington ballroom glittered and hummed. Heads had turned when they'd entered. Whispers were spreading through the crowd with the efficiency of wildfire through dry grass. Adrien could feel the attention measuring, calculating, waiting to see how this would play out. He stayed close to Maris as they moved deeper into the room. Not in front of her, not steering her, beside her. And slowly, conversation by conversation, he began to understand something he'd been missing. Maris wasn't here to survive the night. She was here to change it. Richard Ashford found them near the bar, bourbon in hand. The particular smile of a man who has decided his cruelty is actually a form of honesty. Adrien and the infamous Maris Bennett. He looked her over with the unguarded appraisal of someone who'd already decided the verdict before the evidence arrived. Tell me, how does it feel to be the most talked about person at the Harrington Gala? Much like being discussed by strangers always feels, Maris replied, accepting a fresh glass from a passing server without hurry. Tedious. Richard's smile sharpened. Confidence. I like that. Though confidence only carries you so far in rooms like this, eventually substance matters, connections, background. The things that separate people who belong from people who are just visiting. Is that what you tell yourself? Maris asked. Her voice was conversational, almost gentle. That your presence here is justified by bloodline rather than anything you've actually accomplished. The small cluster of nearby guests who had been pretending not to listen stopped pretending entirely. Richard's smile vanished. Careful, sweetheart. You're out of your depth. Am I? Maris set her champagne down on a nearby table with deliberate, unhurried care. Because from where I stand, I'm having a conversation with a man who spent his entire life being told he matters because of his last name, who's never had to prove his worth because it was assigned at birth. A man who looks at someone like me and sees a threat not to anything he's built because he hasn't built much, but to the only thing that makes him feel superior, the accident of his birth. The silence that fell over the surrounding space was extraordinary. Someone somewhere behind Adrien drew a sharp, small breath. Richard's face had gone the color of the bourbon in his glass. Adrien. His voice shook with barely controlled fury. Control your date before she embarrasses herself further. She's not my date, Adrien said quietly. She's my guest, and she doesn't need controlling. She needs listening to. He paused. You should try it. Richard drained his glass and walked away through the crowd, his back rigid with wounded pride. The gathered onlookers dispersed quickly, unwilling to be caught associated with what had just happened. Adrien turned to Maris. Was that necessary? He was going to escalate regardless, she said. Better to meet it head on than let him control the narrative. She smoothed her dress with one clean gesture. Besides, he was already my enemy. I simply stopped pretending otherwise. Adrien studied her in the soft chandelier light. 3 years. 3 years he'd worked beside this woman, watched her make herself smaller, watched her contain all of this, the intelligence, the precision, the absolute unassailable clarity inside the professional dimensions of a job title. He wondered, not for the first time tonight, how much it had cost her. And then, from across the ballroom, a voice cut through the ambient noise of music and crystal. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please. Catherine Harrington stood at the top of the grand staircase, silver-gowned and effortlessly commanding the crowd quieting below her like water settling after a stone. Thank you all for attending tonight's gala. As many of you know, this evening celebrates not just social connection, but meaningful philanthropy. Our featured initiative this year addresses a crisis affecting millions, the lack of accessible quality healthcare for children in underserved communities. Adrien felt Maris go still beside him. Not tensed, still. The particular stillness of someone containing a reaction. Thanks to the extraordinary generosity of our donors, we've raised over $12 million for the Harrington Foundation's Children's Health Initiative. But tonight, I want to recognize a contribution that goes beyond a financial gift. One donor didn't simply write a check. They designed the entire program from the ground up. The murmur that moved through the crowd was genuine, curious, engaged searching. This individual worked for 18 months to create a sustainable model combining mobile health clinics, telemedicine infrastructure, and community education programs. They personally vetted every vendor, every partner organization, every piece of medical equipment. They built something that will serve over 50,000 children in its first year alone. Adrien turned to look at Maris. Her face was carefully, precisely blank, the expression she wore when she was hiding something significant. Our mystery philanthropist has chosen to remain anonymous until tonight. Catherine's gaze moved through the crowd with calm purpose. They've agreed to let me reveal their identity because the work matters more than the privacy. A breath moved through the ballroom. 300 people leaned almost imperceptibly forward. Ladies and gentlemen, the architect and primary funder of the Harrington Foundation's Children's Health Initiative is Maris Bennett. The room exploded into stunned, speechless silence, then into shocked murmurs, then into Catherine Harrington's voice, warm and certain, calling from the top of the stairs. Miss Bennett, would you join me, please? Adrien stared at Maris. She stood absolutely still, her expression unreadable. He watched her take a single slow breath, watched the moment she made a decision, watched something that had been waiting a long time finally give way. And then she walked forward. The crowd parted for her as she moved. Heads turned following her progress through the room, and on many of those faces, Adrien watched something extraordinary happen. He watched certainty curdle, watched contempt dissolve into confusion, watched the careful social mathematics of the evening recalculate itself in real time. He watched the faces of the people who had spent the last 2 hours treating her as an interloper, and he watched those people understand one by one exactly what they had done. Maris climbed the grand staircase and turned to face the room. 300 of the wealthiest, most connected people in America looked up at the woman they had dismissed. 18 months ago, Maris began, her voice carrying with quiet, absolute clarity through the silence. I received news that a child I'd been mentoring through a community program had died. Not a sound in the room. She died from complications of diabetes. Not because the condition was untreatable, because her family couldn't afford consistent medical care. A pause. She was 9 years old. The silence was the kind that has weight. I realized that night that I could keep being angry about systemic failures, or I could try to fix one small part of the system. She looked out across the crowd, and Adrien, watching from the floor below, saw her gaze move deliberately calmly to Richard Ashford, to Vivian Lassier, to the Vandermeers, to every person who had spent this evening measuring her and finding her lacking. The Harrington Foundation's Children's Health Initiative, she continued, combines mobile clinics that bring medical care directly to underserved neighborhoods, telemedicine that connects families with specialists they'd never otherwise access, and education programs that teach parents to recognize warning signs before they become emergencies. It's designed to be replicable. Other cities, other foundations can adapt the model, because this isn't about me. It's about changing a system that lets children die because their parents can't afford insurance. She paused and something moved in her eyes. Not sentimentality, but something fiercer, something that had survived a long time without an audience. I funded this initiative with money I earned through careful investments and a significant inheritance from my grandmother, who spent her life as a pediatric nurse in rural communities. She believed healthcare was a right, not a privilege. A beat. This program is her legacy as much as mine. The applause began with Catherine Harrington and spread through the room like a tide, hesitant at first, then building, then genuine in the way that applause rarely was in spaces like this. Adrien clapped until his hands ached. He watched Maris descend the staircase as the crowd pressed forward, arms reaching, voices calling. Watched her navigate through them with the same calm efficiency she brought to every impossible situation. Watched her ignore the reaching hands and the suddenly warm faces of people who had been hostile 30 minutes ago. She was making her way back to him. When she reached him, he could see the slight tremor in her hands that she immediately controlled, the tension around her eyes that she was working to smooth. "You okay?" he asked quietly. "Ask me in an hour," she said, "when I'm not fighting the urge to either cry or scream. You were incredible up there. I was necessary up there." She accepted a glass of water from a nearby server, bypassing the champagne. "There's a difference." Adrien looked at her, this woman who had worked beside him for 3 years, who had made herself invisible in order to survive, who had spent 18 months building something extraordinary in complete silence, and felt something vast and aching expand in his chest. He had brought her here thinking in some part of himself he hadn't fully examined that he was giving her something, an opportunity, a platform, a moment in the light. It had never occurred to him that she had already been working in the light for a long time. He just hadn't known where to look. Caroline Hartwick found them first. She materialized from the crowd with the careful, measured approach of someone who had decided to make a strategic retreat look like a social call. Her expression arranged into the precise configuration of gracious acknowledgement. Her timing calculated to arrive before the less sophisticated members of the room made complete fools of themselves by staying hostile. "Maris," Caroline's voice was smooth, controlled, and carrying the particular quality of a woman choosing every syllable. "That was quite a revelation." "Was it?" Maris turned to face her. Not a question, a statement, quiet and even. Caroline flinched slightly. I mean the program, the initiative. It's extraordinary work, genuinely. She paused. I may have misjudged the situation earlier. When I called Adrien about his choice of guest, you assumed I was inappropriate for this event because of my job title, Maris said. Her tone was not unkind. It was something more difficult than unkind. It was precise. You operated on the assumption that executive assistants lack the education, the resources, or the vision to participate meaningfully in philanthropic work. A beat. You were wrong. But the question isn't whether you misjudged me. It's whether you'll examine why you made those assumptions in the first place. Caroline opened her mouth, closed it, and then did something Adrien had never in 4 years of shared board meetings seen Caroline Hartwick do. She simply nodded and walked away. No comeback, no recovery, no strategic pivot, just the acknowledgement, silent and humbling, that there was nothing useful left to say. Adrien watched her go. You realize you just made her think harder than she has in years. Good, Maris said. It looked like she needed the exercise. Others came in waves after that, some offering genuine congratulations with the slightly dazed quality of people recalibrating in real time. Others arriving with the transparent agenda of wanting to be seen associating with someone who had just become significantly more interesting. A foundation director shook Maris's hand with genuine warmth and talked about collaborative potential. A city council member wanted to discuss the program's policy implications. 2 women who had whispered behind their champagne glasses an hour ago now smiled with the practiced sincerity of people hoping nobody remembered what they'd said. Maris handled every interaction with the same even courtesy, present professional, entirely unimpressed. She accepted congratulations without false modesty and redirected conversations toward the work rather than herself with the efficiency of someone who had already decided what this evening was actually for. But Adrien watched her carefully, the way he'd learned to watch her over 3 years, and he caught the small things the room couldn't see. The slight tightening around her eyes when the crowd pressed too close. The way she positioned herself subtly so that his shoulder was between her and the loudest cluster of guests. The controlled evenness of her breathing that told him she was working harder than she appeared. You want some air? He asked quietly when a brief gap appeared between conversations. The relief in her expression lasted exactly 1 second before her composure closed over it again. Yes, she said, please. They moved through the ballroom together, Adrien steering them toward the terrace with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years navigating rooms designed to be difficult to leave. A few people moved as if to intercept them, but he kept their trajectory clean and consistent, and within 2 minutes they were through the French doors and into the cool October night. The terrace overlooked formal gardens lit by amber landscape lighting, precise hedgerows, and late-season roses glowing against the darkness. At the far end, 2 other couples stood in quiet conversation. This corner was empty. Maris gripped the stone railing and exhaled slowly, fully, the kind of breath that releases something held for a long time. That was harder than I expected, she said. You seemed completely composed. Years of practice. She looked out at the gardens without really seeing them. Do you know what it's like to work in corporate spaces as a woman? To know that every interaction is being evaluated not just on competence, but on likability. That being too assertive makes you difficult, but being too accommodating makes you weak. That your appearance matters more than your credentials, but caring about your appearance makes you vain. She paused. I learned to make myself small, to be capable without being threatening, to know everything without appearing to know more than the men in the room, to smile and deflect and never ever let them see that I was smarter, more capable, more ambitious than my title suggested. Her hands were quiet on the railing. Because that's how you survive. Adrien moved to stand beside her, close enough that she wouldn't feel alone in the dark. And tonight, you stopped surviving. Tonight I got tired of being small. She turned to face him, and in the amber light from the gardens, her expression carried something open and undefended that he rarely had the privilege of seeing. Do you know why I really agreed to come with you? Not the answer I gave you in your office. Tell me. I was angry. She said it simply without drama. Angry at a world that looks at someone like you, self-made, brilliant, genuinely accomplished, and still treats you like an outsider because you didn't inherit your position. Angry at people like Richard, who've accomplished nothing but perform superiority because of bloodlines they had no hand in choosing. Angry at myself for playing along, for years of accepting that my value was something other people got to determine. Her voice grew steadier as she spoke the words, finding their weight. So I came tonight to prove something. Not to them. They're never going to truly accept either of us. And honestly, I stopped wanting them to somewhere around the second phone call Richard made to your office. But to myself. That I could stand in their spotlight and not shrink. That I could face their judgment and survive it. That I could be exactly who I am without apology in a room full of people who would prefer I didn't exist. The garden lights flickered softly in the evening breeze. This was never about me protecting you, Adrien said. No, the word was gentle. Though I appreciate the impulse, this was about me choosing to be visible, choosing to claim space I've been told I don't deserve. She almost smiled. If that makes them uncomfortable, if that threatens their carefully maintained hierarchies, that's their problem to solve, not mine. Maris, I know what you're going to say. She held up one hand. That I'm brave, that I'm inspiring, but I don't need platitudes, Adrien. I need you to understand that this moment, this evening, it's not about whatever our relationship is or isn't becoming. It's about reclaiming agency I gave away years ago when I decided invisibility was safer than visibility. Adrien was quiet for a moment. The distant music from inside the ballroom drifted past them incongruously festive. Then I'm honored, he said finally, that you chose me to stand beside, not as protection, as witness. Something in her expression shifted, softened fractionally in the way that things soften when they've been proven unnecessary. You're learning, she said, slowly, but you're trying. A pause. That matters more than you know. They stood in the comfortable silence that had always been one of the defining qualities of their time together. The particular ease of two people who had spent enough hours in each other's company to have moved past the performance of conversation into something more honest. Below them, the garden sat in its amber light. Above them, the first stars had appeared. They're going to come after you harder now, Maris said eventually. Not just me, you, for bringing me, for defending me, for refusing to apologize for it. Let them. I'm serious, Adrien. These people control board seats, investment partnerships, political connections that smooth regulatory pathways. They can make your professional life genuinely difficult. They can try. He leaned against the railing. But they need Veilcore more than I need their cocktail party invitations. They want to ostracize me for treating you with basic human respect. He stopped. Then more quietly. I built an $8 billion company because I refused to accept the limitations other people tried to impose on me. I changed an industry because I was willing to break rules that no longer served anyone. And I've been letting these people make me feel like I still needed their permission to exist in their world. He straightened, and something clarified in his expression, the particular quality of someone arriving at a decision they've been circling for a long time. That ends tonight. Maris studied him with the careful assessment she brought to things she genuinely wasn't certain of. You're serious? Completely. He met her eyes. They wanted a show. Fine, they got one. But the story they'll tell isn't the one they expected. They thought they'd watch you get humiliated. Instead, they watched you reveal yourself as more accomplished, more generous, and more genuinely powerful than most of them combined. He paused. That must be eating them alive. Probably, Maris agreed, and he heard the smile beneath it. Though I imagine Richard's version involves in being a scheming social climber who bought her way into relevance. Let him tell whatever story helps him sleep. Everyone else saw the truth. A burst of laughter drifted through the open doors from inside the gala. Shifting now into its later looser phase, the formal program concluded, the dancing begun. The particular sound of wealthy people who had stopped performing and started simply being wealthy. We should go back in, Maris said without enthusiasm. Or, Adrien countered, we could leave. Get actual food instead of architectural sculptures pretending to be appetizers. Talk like humans instead of performing for an audience. She turned to look at him. Something lit up in her eyes, the specific brightness that appeared when she encountered a problem with a better solution than the obvious one. You'd really walk out of the Harrington Gala before the scheduled end time. Watch me. He offered his arm. Unless you want to stay and receive your adoring masses. They're not my masses, Maris said, taking his arm. They're people recalculating their assessment of me based on my bank account. I'd much rather get pizza and debrief this absolute chaos of an evening. They moved back through the ballroom together, and Adrien felt the shift the moment they crossed the threshold, the quality of attention changing around them. Not the earlier scrutiny measuring and dismissive, but something different. Curious, recalibrated. The eyes that followed them now carried the particular expression of people who have been wrong about something important and are still working out how to arrange their faces. He steered them efficiently toward the exit, deflecting 2 attempted interceptions with the smooth finality of someone who has made a decision and is simply executing it. Catherine Harrington caught them at the door. Leaving so soon. Her smile was warm, and unlike most of the smiles in the room tonight, it reached her eyes. Early morning, Adrien said smoothly. Thank you for a memorable evening. Indeed. Catherine turned to Maris, and her expression carried something that looked like genuine respect, not the recalculated variety currently circulating through the ballroom, but the kind that had clearly existed before tonight's revelation, already formed from 18 months of working partnership. Maris, I hope we'll talk more about the program. I have thoughts about expansion possibilities. I'd welcome that conversation, Maris said. My office will reach out to schedule something. They escaped into the cool night, the valet scrambling the estate blazing behind them. Then Vivienne Lassier emerged from the entrance, her expression arranged into something saccharine and calculating in equal measure. Maris, darling. She moved toward them with the particular velocity of someone who has decided the best defense is a preemptive social maneuver. I feel terrible about earlier. I didn't realize you were such an accomplished philanthropist. We should have lunch. I'd love to discuss collaboration opportunities. I'm sure you would, Maris replied pleasantly. Unfortunately, I'm quite busy with existing commitments. Vivian's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Well, if your schedule opens up, it won't, Maris said, still pleasant, completely final. But I appreciate the thought. The car arrived with immaculate timing, and they were inside and moving before Vivian could recalibrate. For exactly 4 seconds, both of them maintained composure. Then Maris started laughing deep, genuine, helpless laughter that shook her shoulders and made her press her hand briefly over her mouth, then give up and let it come. Did you see her face? She managed between laughs. The absolute shock when I turned her down. She genuinely expected me to be grateful. Adrien found himself laughing too, not the polished diplomatic laugh he deployed at events, but the real one, the one that came from somewhere unguarded. The tension of the entire evening dissolved in it like salt in warm water. She expected you to scramble for her approval, he said, now that you've been revealed as someone worth knowing. Instead, she gets exactly what she gave me an hour ago. Maris wiped the corners of her eyes carefully, preserving her makeup from long habit. Polite dismissal. I'm going to enjoy that memory for years. The car moved through the city, leaving the Harrington estate and its elaborate social theater behind them. The skyline opened up as they merged onto the main road, the same skyline Adrien had stood at the window watching for years, feeling empty despite the $8 billion it represented. It looked different tonight. Or perhaps he was different. He wasn't entirely sure which. Pizza, Maris said, the laughter settling into something quieter and warmer. Pizza, he confirmed. The greasiest, most inappropriately formal wear-adjacent pizza in the city. I know exactly the place you mean. They drove in comfortable silence for a while, the city moving past outside the windows. Adrien found himself aware of small things, the way Maris had kicked off one heel and was rubbing her ankle with characteristic practicality, the slight smile that stayed at the corner of her mouth as she looked out at the passing streets, the quality of her quiet, which had always been different from other people's silence, less empty, more deliberate. Thank you, she said eventually without looking at him, for standing beside me instead of in front of me, for trusting that I could handle myself, for not trying to rescue me from situations I chose to walk into. Thank you, Adrien said, for showing me what real courage actually looks like. She turned to look at him then, and in the moving light of the city outside her eyes were clear and direct, and carrying something that he recognized with a sensation like stepping onto ice and feeling it hold is more than professional regard. "We make a good team," she said. "We do." He held her gaze. "The question is what we do now." Maris was quiet for a moment. Then, "Now we eat pizza decompress and discuss plans for burning down the rest of the social hierarchies that need destroying." He laughed. "Ambitious." "You expected anything less?" "Not even slightly." The pizzeria was a narrow storefront on a block that gentrification had somehow missed, wedged between a dry cleaner and a hardware store with a handwritten sign in the window. The owner, a compact man in his 60s named Sal, greeted Adrien by his first name and led them to the corner booth without commentary or surprise, which was in Adrien's opinion one of Sal's finest qualities. Maris looked around the place, the mismatched chairs, the checkered tablecloths, the photographs of old neighborhoods covering every inch of available wall space, and something in her posture changed. She settled into the booth like someone arriving somewhere rather than just stopping somewhere. "This is real," she said. "Best pizza in the city." Adrien loosened his bow tie without entirely removing it. "I've been coming here since before anyone knew my name." "It shows." She picked up the laminated menu and set it back down immediately. "What do you recommend but—" "Everything. Order obscenely. We've earned it." They did. Sal brought a pitcher of water and 2 sodas without being asked, raised an eyebrow at Maris's gown with the air of a man who had seen many things and chosen to comment on none of them, and disappeared into the kitchen. The conversation that followed was different from every conversation they'd had in 3 years of working together. Not because they talked about different things. They covered the healthcare initiative's next phase, a new Valecore product launch, the particular absurdity of certain moments from the evening, but because the invisible architecture of professional distance was gone. No careful calibration of what was appropriate to say. No management of tone or topic based on the requirements of their respective roles. Just 2 people who had spent years learning each other in one context, discovering that the person they'd known contained more than the context had allowed them to show. Maris talked about her grandmother, the pediatric nurse who had driven a secondhand car across 4 counties to reach families who couldn't reach her, who had kept handwritten notes on every patient she'd ever treated, who had told a young Maris that the most radical act available to a person was to decide that other people's suffering was their own problem to solve. She talked about watching her mother navigate corporate environments 20 years before Maris would do the same, absorbing lessons in invisibility and strategy before she was old enough to understand why they were necessary. Adrien told her things he rarely told anyone. About the years before Valecore, when the gap between what he could imagine and what he could afford had been so vast it kept him awake at 2 in the morning, staring at ceilings in apartments that leaked. About the first investor who had believed in the company, not a gracious patron, but a sharp-eyed pragmatist who'd said, "I'm not doing you a favor. I'm making a bet. And if you lose it, I'll never speak to you again." About the strange vertigo of the first time he'd seen his face on a magazine cover and felt, instead of triumph, an acute and bewildering sense of loss for the person who had existed before the cover. "When did success stop feeling like victory?" Maris asked. He thought about it honestly. About 6 months after the IPO. I'd spent 5 years telling myself that the goal was the company, the building of it, the proving of it. And then we went public. And everyone told me I'd won. And I remember standing in my office that night looking at the numbers and thinking, he paused, thinking now what? The achievement had outpaced the meaning. Exactly. He looked at her across the table. "How did you know, Because I watched it happen to you," she said simply, "from the outside, for 3 years." The admission landed with unexpected weight, not accusatory, observational. The particular intimacy of being truly seen by someone who had watched without judgment and drawn honest conclusions. "What did you see?" he asked. Maris considered the question with the seriousness she gave to things that deserved it. A brilliant man who had convinced himself that competence was the same thing as connection, who filled his life with achievement because achievement was quantifiable and connection was not, who kept people at the exact distance where they could admire him but not know him. She met his eyes. And who had no idea he was doing any of it. The honesty of it should have been uncomfortable, Instead, it felt like something he hadn't known he'd been waiting for. "And you?" he asked. "What were you doing watching?" A pause. "And trying to decide whether staying invisible was still worth the cost." They ate. Outside, the city moved through its late-night rhythms, a taxi argument, a group of young people moving in the loose orbit of Saturday night, the hiss of a bus pulling away from a stop. The pizzeria hummed quietly around them. It was nearly midnight when Maris looked at her phone and then set it face down on the table. "Richard Ashford has already texted 3 of his contacts about tonight," she said. "My guess is by tomorrow morning, the version of events that reaches the business press will feature me as either a scheming opportunist or a charity case your pity elevated." Adrien tore off a piece of crust. "Let him." "Adrien, I mean it. What is he actually going to do? Tell people that my executive assistant turned out to have built a $12 million healthcare initiative, that she made him look like a fool in front of 300 people by being more accomplished than his entire social circle combined?" He looked up. "That's not a story that damages you. That's a story that embarrasses him." Maris was quiet for a moment. "You're not wrong," she said finally. "But there will be versions of it that are harder to dismiss." "I know." He set down the crust. "And I'm not pretending it won't cost anything. Some of those board relationships, some of those investor connections, there are people in that room tonight who are going to decide that the easier path is to align with Marcus and Richard rather than recalibrate their worldview." He paused. "I'm telling you, I don't care." She looked at him steadily. "Why not?" "Because those relationships were always conditional on me being a particular version of myself. The acceptable outsider. The tolerated self-made man who knew his place in the hierarchy." He leaned forward slightly. "I don't want conditional. I never did. I just hadn't figured out yet that I was allowed to say so." Something moved in Maris's expression, a shift so subtle it might have been the candlelight. But he'd been watching her face for 3 years, and he knew it wasn't. "Adrien, you don't have to say anything." "I wasn't going to say anything profound," she said. "I was going to say that you have pizza sauce on your tie." He looked down. He did. Maris handed him a napkin across the table, and when he reached for it, their fingers touched for the second time that evening, the same ordinary contact, the same unremarkable transference of a piece of paper. But this time, neither of them moved away immediately. "What are you thinking?" she asked quietly. Everything he wanted to say. That you've been in my life for 3 years, and I've been looking without seeing. That tonight shifted something fundamental in how I understand my own story. That I drove you here in a $60,000 car to a $10 pizzeria, and this is the best evening I've had in years, and I know exactly why. That this is the most honest conversation I've had in a very long time," he said. Maris looked at him for a moment, long, direct, unhurried. "Me too," she said. She took her hand back. She reached for another slice of pizza. And they talked until the chairs were being stacked on tables around them, and Sal appeared with the particular patient expression of a man who respected his regular customers, but also had a home to go to. In the car on the way back to Maris's apartment, the city moved past in its late-night configuration, quieter now, more honest, stripped of the performance it mounted during waking hours. Maris had her shoes off and was carrying them in one hand, the pizza box of leftovers balanced on her knees, with casual practicality that made Adrien smile at the windshield. She was still humming the same unconscious, almost silent melody she'd been making for the last 20 minutes, which he recognized with a small shock as a song that had been playing quietly in the restaurant during their last hour there. She didn't know she was doing it. He filed it away with all the other things he was collecting. When he walked her to her door, he was acutely aware that something had shifted in the geometry between them. Not dramatically. Not in any way he could have identified to a third party, but real nonetheless. The professional scaffolding that had defined their interactions for 3 years was still technically present, but something had changed in how it fit. 2 weeks, Maris said it, her door key in hand. She looked up at him. "Thank you for all of it." "Get some sleep," he said. "Tomorrow is going to be interesting." "You borrowed my word." It seemed accurate. He paused. "I'll see you Monday." "You'll see me Monday," she agreed. She went inside. The door closed. Adrien stood in the hallway for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, aware of nothing in particular except the quality of the quiet she'd left behind and the distinct, uncomfortable, exhilarating sensation of something beginning. He drove home through the late city dark, and for the first time in longer than he could accurately remember, the penthouse waiting for him at the other end of the drive didn't feel like an endpoint. It felt like a temporary stop. His phone buzzed as he pulled into the garage. A text from Maris sent 3 minutes ago. "For the record, I told you so." He stared at it, then typed back about which part. Her response came quickly. "All of it. But especially the part where they treated me like I wandered in from catering. You owe me one 'I told you so' redeemable at a time of my choosing." He was still smiling when he got into the elevator. Accepted, he typed. "Terms and conditions to be negotiated." "Non-negotiable," she replied. "Good night, Adrien." "Good night, Maris." He rode up 60 floors to his penthouse, and the city glittered through the windows as it always had, 10,000 lights, 10,000 lives. The same skyline he'd pressed his palm against 1,000 evenings, feeling the hollow weight of a life built on transactions. Tonight, it looked different. Tonight, it looked like possibility. He was still standing at the window jacket off bow tie, hanging loose when his phone buzzed one final time. Not Maris, a news alert. A gossip column update. The headline read, "Vale Corp CEO Adrien Vale causes stir at Harrington Gala with mystery guest insider details." He read it once. Then he turned his phone face down on the windowsill, poured himself a glass of water from the kitchen, because he'd never actually touched the whiskey from earlier, and went to bed. Monday morning arrived with the subtlety of a wrecking ball. Adrien's phone started buzzing at 6:30 board members, investors, business associates, who had either attended the gala or heard the secondhand version, which, in his experience, was always worse. He let every call go to voicemail, showered, dressed, reviewed his mental preparation for whatever waited at the office with the methodical focus he usually reserved for hostile negotiations. He arrived at 7:45. Maris was already at her desk. Of course she was. "Good morning." She handed him his coffee with the unhurried efficiency of someone for whom the events of Friday night had apparently required no recovery time whatsoever. "You have 17 messages flagged urgent, a dozen interview requests from business publications, and Senator Michaels wants to discuss optics and appropriate professional boundaries." She looked up. "I've scheduled nothing until you've had a chance to review the situation." He accepted the coffee. "How bad is it?" "Depends on your definition of bad." She pulled up her tablet. "The business community is divided. Half think you made a brilliant strategic move showing you value substance over superficial social connections. The other half think you've damaged your reputation by defying social conventions." She paused. "The gossip columns are having a field day. And personally," Maris met his eyes steadily, "I've received 43 LinkedIn requests, 15 direct job offers from competitors, and 7 invitations to join philanthropic boards." A beat. "Also, Richard Ashford's office called to inform me I'm no longer welcome at the Metropolitan Club." "Have you ever been to the Metropolitan Club?" "I have not, nor did I have any intention of going." She set down her tablet. "So I'm not particularly devastated." Despite everything, he laughed. Then the laughter faded as he registered what she'd said about the job offers. 15 offers, he repeated. 15. She held his gaze, and he understood that she was telling him something more than a number. "Maris, one thing at a time," she said quietly. "Marcus Vandermeer called 3 board members this morning. He's pushing for an emergency meeting." The weight of Monday settled back onto Adrien's shoulders, displacing the remnant warmth of Friday night with something harder and colder. He set down his coffee and moved toward his office. At the threshold, he stopped. "For what it's worth," he said without turning around, "I'd do Friday night again, exactly the same." He heard the small pause before she replied. "I know," Maris said. "So would I." He went into his office and closed the door, and the day that would change everything began. The emergency board meeting was called for 3 o'clock. Adrien learned this at 9:15 when Catherine Chen Valecor's chief legal officer appeared in his office doorway with the expression she reserved for situations that required both legal precision and human delicacy, a combination she navigated better than anyone he'd ever hired. Marcus has been on the phone since 7 this morning, Catherine said, closing the door behind her. He's framing this as a leadership crisis. Compromised judgment, inappropriate personal relationships, affecting professional decision-making, PR risks to shareholder value. She settled into the chair across from his desk and set down a leather portfolio with the careful deliberateness of someone placing evidence. He's got 2 board members committed to the narrative. 3 are firmly in your corner. Patricia Thornwell and James Morrison are undecided. Adrien was quiet for a moment. Outside his office, through the glass wall, he could see Maris at her desk phone to her ear tablet open, working through the morning's chaos with the same focused efficiency she brought to everything. She hadn't looked up since he'd come in. She didn't need to. "What do we need to win the undecideds?" he asked. Patricia responds to data and logic. James responds to personal loyalty. Catherine opened the portfolio. "We have 8 hours to build cases that speak to both." "Then let's build them." Catherine nodded, already pulling up documents. "I'll need Maris." "She'll want to be involved anyway," Adrien said. Then more quietly, "She's going to try to offer to step back, to create distance to protect the company. I need you to know in advance that I won't accept that." Catherine looked at him over the edge of her reading glasses for a long moment. "Noted," she said, "though you should also know that how you handle this matters as much as the outcome. If you fight the board by making it personal, you give Marcus exactly what he wants. You need to fight it on Valecor's terms, performance, results, merit. And if he makes it personal anyway, then we make him look petty for doing so." She almost smiled, which, fortunately, shouldn't be difficult. They brought Maris in at 9:30. She crossed the office with a tablet already loaded with data she'd apparently been compiling since before Adrien had arrived, and set it on the conference table without preamble. "Valecor's performance metrics for the past 18 months, she said, pulling up the first screen. "Revenue up 37%. Product launches outperforming projections. Employee satisfaction at a company high. Acquisition integrations running ahead of schedule." She looked between Catherine and Adrien. "Marcus is arguing compromised judgment. The data argues the opposite. We lead with this." "Agreed," Catherine said. "Patricia Thornwell will want to see the numbers in context, not just Valecor in isolation, but relative to industry benchmarks and comparable companies. I'll pull the comparative analysis." Maris moved to the next screen. "James Morrison is a loyalty argument. He's been on the board since the Series B. He's seen Adrien navigate the hostile takeover attempt, the regulatory investigation, the market crash of 4 years ago. We remind him of that track record." "And Marcus's argument about the Gala itself?" Adrien asked. Maris didn't hesitate. "We don't defend it. We make it irrelevant." She set down the tablet. "The moment we argue about whether attending a social event with me was appropriate or inappropriate, we've accepted the frame that my presence requires justification. We reject the frame entirely. Valecor's performance is exceptional. Adrien's leadership decisions have been consistently sound. His personal social life is his own business, as it is for every other CEO in America." Catherine pointed at Maris. "That's the argument." "That's always been the argument," Maris said. "Marcus knows it, which is why he's been making calls rather than filing formal motions. He's trying to build political pressure because he can't build a legal case." Adrien watched her work, the quick precision of her analysis, the calm certainty of her reasoning, and thought about what she'd said Friday night. "I've spent my entire career making myself invisible, competent, but unobtrusive." He thought about how much of this intelligence, this strategic clarity had been present all along, managed down to fit inside the dimensions of a job title. He thought about what that cost sustained over years. "Maris," he said. She looked up. "Whatever happens today, I need you to know that none of this changes anything on my end. Not the way I think about your work, not—" He paused, aware of Catherine in the room, choosing his words with care. "Not any of it." Maris held his gaze for a moment. Something moved in her expression, not the composure slipping, but something more complex than composure, briefly visible underneath it. "I know," she said, and then returning to the tablet, "Now let's win this vote." The morning moved at the compressed speed of genuine crisis. Catherine worked the legal angles, pulling precedents and documentation with methodical efficiency. Maris built the presentation materials data. Visualize context-established narrative controlled with a speed that suggested she'd been thinking about this possibility since the first phone call arrived from Richard Ashford 2 days ago. At noon, Patricia Thornwell called. Adrien took it alone in his office with the door closed. "I want to hear your side before this afternoon's circus," Patricia said. She was 72, had been on Valecor's board since before the IPO, and had the particular directness of someone who had stopped finding social performance useful about 20 years ago. Marcus is painting a picture of a CEO who's lost focus, who's let personal feelings compromise professional judgment. Is he right? No. Don't give me one word. Give me a reason. Adrien exhaled slowly. By every objective measure, revenue, product performance, market position, employee retention, Valecor is stronger than it's ever been. There's no decision I've made in the past 6 months or the past 3 years that doesn't hold up to scrutiny. If Marcus has evidence that my judgment has been compromised, I'd like to see it because I haven't. He says bringing your assistant to the Harrington Gala demonstrates poor risk assessment. I invited a friend to a social event. He kept his voice even. I've been attending these events for 7 years. The social dynamics of the Harrington Gala have never once intersected with a single business decision. The suggestion that they would now is... He paused, choosing the word carefully. It's designed to sound reasonable while being entirely without substance. "Tell me about her," Patricia said. The shift caught him slightly off guard. "Maris, who else would I mean?" He took a breath. Double major from MIT Business and Computer Science, graduated summa cum laude, 5 years of experience before Valecor. In 3 years with us, she's streamlined administrative operations, managed confidential information without a single breach, and saved the company approximately $14 million through efficiency improvements that I wouldn't have identified on my own. He paused. She also, as you saw from the news this morning, designed and funded a $12 million pediatric healthcare initiative from scratch, without telling anyone. A pause on Patricia's end. "That last part," Patricia said, "was that a surprise to you?" "A complete one." Another pause longer. "Marcus says you're in love with her." The accusation hit the way accurate things hit, not like a blow, but like a weight settling somewhere it intended to stay. "What I feel personally," Adrien said carefully, "is irrelevant to my ability to run this company. My decisions as CEO are based on data market analysis and the counsel of people I trust. My social life is my own business. The two don't intersect." "And if they did," Patricia pressed, "if this woman, this friend, starts influencing your thinking, affecting choices, creating conflict between what's good for her and what's good for Valecor, then I would recuse myself from decisions where conflicts exist," Adrien said, "exactly as board members do when their investments or personal connections create potential conflicts. I'm not exempt from professional ethics, Patricia, but I'm also not going to apologize for having a life outside these walls." The silence stretched. "Send me everything Catherine's been compiling," Patricia said finally. "All of it. I want to see exactly how well Valecor is actually doing underneath this social drama." A pause. "And Adrien, this better be worth it. Because if you're gambling the company you built on personal feeling, on any personal feeling, you're not the leader I thought you were." The line went dead. He sat very still for a moment afterward, hands flat on the desk, feeling the weight of it. Then he opened his office door. Maris was standing at the edge of the outer office with 2 cups of coffee, which meant she'd been waiting close enough to know when the call ended. She came in, set 1 cup on his desk, and read his expression with the accuracy of someone who had been reading him for 3 years. "Patricia's not convinced yet," she said. "No, but she's willing to look at the data." He accepted the coffee. "She asked about you." "What did she ask?" "Who you are." He met her eyes. "I told her." Maris was quiet for a moment. "All of it? Your credentials, the company impact, the healthcare initiative." He paused. "She also told me Marcus has been saying I'm in love with you." The air in the room changed slightly. Not dramatically, just a fractional shift in pressure, the way it changes before weather. "And what did you say?" Maris asked. Her voice was steady. Her hands were still. "That my personal feelings are irrelevant to my ability to run the company." He held her gaze. "Which is true. and also not the complete answer. A long moment passed between them, the particular kind of moment that contains more than conversation can efficiently carry. One thing at a time, Maris said finally, her voice quieter than before. Win the vote first. He nodded. They went back to work. At 2:45, Adrien, Catherine, and Maris stood in the hallway outside the top-floor conference room. Through the frosted glass, the shapes of board members were visible, taking their seats at the mahogany table. Marcus Vandermeer's silhouette was unmistakable, broad-shouldered, positioned at the far end, already holding court with his two allies. Maris doesn't come in, Catherine said quietly. Marcus will use her presence as evidence of inappropriate influence. I know it's not fair. It's strategic, Maris said. I know. She looked at Adrien. The data makes the argument better than I can in that room right now. Use it. He held her gaze for a moment. She gave a single small nod, precise, certain the nod of someone who has made their peace with a decision. He went in. The conference room had the specific cold quality of spaces designed for conflict. Floor-to-ceiling windows threw afternoon light across the table, which Adrien had always suspected was deliberate, putting the sun at the backs of whoever sat at the far end, which today was Marcus, his face partially shadowed while Adrien would be lit from the side. He noted it, filed it, and took his seat at the head of the table. Thank you all for gathering on short notice. Marcus began, not waiting, a small territorial move that Adrien recognized and did not react to. We have a situation that requires immediate attention. Adrien's recent behavior has created significant reputation risks for Valecore, and we need to address them before they impact shareholder value. What behavior specifically? Patricia asked from the middle of the table. Her voice was precise, carrying the tone of someone who had decided to require exactness rather than accept innuendo. Be specific, Marcus. Marcus sat straighter. His decision to bring his executive assistant to the Harrington Gala as a personal guest, creating the appearance of an inappropriate relationship between a CEO and a direct subordinate, generating gossip that reflects poorly on the company, demonstrating judgment that prioritizes personal gratification over corporate image. Has this inappropriate relationship, Patricia said, the quotation marks audible in her tone, affected any business decisions? Has company performance suffered? Are there complaints of favoritism or ethics violations? Marcus hesitated. Not yet, but the potential set. I'm not interested in potential. Patricia cut him off. I'm interested in facts. Has Adrien's personal association with his assistant created any measurable negative impact on Valecore's operations, finances, or market position? The negative impact is to our reputation, Marcus said, his voice gaining an edge. Our standing with investors who value social propriety, our connections in circles that matter. For what? This from James Morrison, speaking from the far side of the table. He was 64, had a careful way of choosing his moments, and his expression was that of a man who had been listening long enough to have formed a conclusion. Cocktail party invitations, Marcus? I've been on this board for 7 years. I've watched Adrien build this company from a borrowed desk into a market leader. I've never once seen him make a business decision based on emotion or compromise Valecore's interests for personal gain. One social event doesn't rewrite 7 years of track record. Marcus's face reddened. This isn't about one event. It's about a pattern. Our revenue is up 37%, Adrien said. The room shifted. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't leaned forward. He'd simply stated a fact in a tone that made everything else in the room wait. We exceeded every financial projection this quarter, he continued. We launched 3 products that are outperforming competitor benchmarks. We acquired 2 companies that strengthen our core market position. Employee satisfaction scores are the highest in Valecore's history. Customer retention is up. Our innovation pipeline is the strongest it's ever been. He looked at Marcus directly. Which part of that suggests compromised leadership? Marcus's jaw worked. Then, the part where you're sleeping with your assistant. The silence that followed was the kind that has texture. Catherine tensed visibly beside Adrien. Patricia's expression went dangerously still. That's a serious allegation, Patricia said, each word measured and separate. Do you have evidence to support it? Marcus faltered. I'm saying there's an appearance. An appearance you created through innuendo and speculation, Patricia said. Unless you have actual evidence of an inappropriate sexual relationship, you're engaging in defamation. Catherine, would you agree? Making unfounded allegations of sexual impropriety could constitute defamation per se. Catherine said, her voice carrying the particular calm of a lawyer who has been waiting to say exactly this. It's actionable both personally and corporately. I'd strongly advise against continuing this line of argument without substantial proof. The two board members flanking Marcus exchanged an uncomfortable look. This had stopped going the way it was supposed to go. Adrien stood. He moved to the windows, needing the slight distance, the physical shift that allowed him to address the room rather than just the table. Below, the city ran its ordinary afternoon business, indifferent to the drama 60 floors above it. "Let me be very clear," he said, and his voice was quiet in a way that required the room to be quiet too. "Maris Bennett is my executive assistant. She's also my friend. I invited her to a social event because I valued her company and wanted to attend with someone whose conversation I actually respected, rather than someone I was performing for." He turned back to face the table. What happened that evening was that Maris revealed herself to be a more significant philanthropist and a more accomplished human being than most of the people in that room combined. The only ones who came out looking bad were those who judged her on assumptions they'd never bothered to verify. He walked slowly back toward his seat. "You want to talk about judgment," he continued. "Then let's talk about it. I've spent years maintaining relationships with people in that social circle because I was told they mattered, because their approval supposedly opened doors. But what has it actually produced?" He looked at Marcus directly. "Richard Ashford attempted to poach 3 of our senior engineers last year. Vivian Lassier shared details of our expansion plans with a competitor. And Marcus..." He paused. "Marcus has been quietly accumulating Valecore stock through shell companies, a pattern consistent with positioning for a hostile takeover attempt." Patricia's head turned toward Marcus with the speed of something that had been waiting for a reason to turn. "Is that true?" she asked. The silence that followed was its own answer. Marcus said nothing. "So when you talk about my judgment being compromised," Adrien said, "what you actually mean is that I stopped pretending to value relationships with people who have never had Valecore's best interests at heart. I chose to spend one evening with someone who has demonstrated loyalty and competence for 3 years, rather than performing gratitude to people who see me as either a threat or an acquisition target." He let the words settle. "That's not poor judgment. That's clarity." James Morrison spoke first. "I'm not supporting this motion." His voice was firm, not declarative, but decided. "Adrien's right. Every metric tells the same story. There's no evidence of compromised leadership. All I'm seeing is a board member using a social event as pretext for a power grab he's been building toward for 2 years. "Neither am I," Patricia said. She looked at Marcus with the expression of someone closing an account. "Adrien's personal life is his own business as long as it doesn't affect his professional performance. Since every available measure suggests his performance is excellent, I see no grounds for questioning his leadership." She gathered her materials. "This meeting is over." Marcus stood his chair, scraping against the marble floor with a sound like something tearing. "You're making a mistake. He's compromised. It's only a matter of time before this woman influences decisions that hurt the company." "This woman has a name," Adrien said, and his voice had gone very cold. "And she's done more for Valecore and for 50,000 children she'll never meet than you have done for anything or anyone in your entire career on this board." He looked at Marcus without flinching. "If you have genuine concerns about company performance, bring data. Bring evidence. Bring something beyond social prejudice and territorial insecurity. Otherwise, I'd suggest you seriously consider whether you have any remaining value to contribute here." Marcus's face had gone the color of something past red. He walked out, his 2 allies following with the diminished energy of people who had bet on the wrong outcome and were already calculating the cost. The door closed behind them. The remaining board members sat for a moment in the residual quiet. Then one by one they began gathering their things. Patricia stopped Adrien at the edge of the room, the others filing past, with the particular discretion of people who understand when a conversation needs privacy. "You won today," she said. Her voice was quieter now, less official, more personal. "But Marcus isn't finished. He'll regroup, find new angles." She studied him. "You need to be prepared for that." "I know." And Adrien. She paused and something shifted in her expression, something that was coming from Patricia Thornwell, the closest thing to warmth she typically offered. You also need to be honest with yourself about what's happening between you and Maris Bennett, because if there's more there than friendship, it will eventually create complications, conflicts of interest, difficult decisions about her role in the company. Her eyes were direct. Start thinking about those possibilities now, before they become problems. He held her gaze. I appreciate the advice. That's not acceptance, she said. That's deflection. But it's your life. She moved toward the door, then stopped once more. For what it's worth, your defense of her today was not the defense of a man who thinks of someone as merely a professional asset. The board can see that. Some of them respect it. Some of them are nervous about it. A pause. All of them are watching. She left. Catherine appeared at his elbow. She's right about the watching. I know. And she's right about the other thing, too. Catherine gathered the last of her documents. Go talk to Maris. She's been in your office for the past 40 minutes looking out the window and pretending she isn't anxious. A brief, rare smile. For what it's worth, I like her. She's the first person I've met in 5 years who manages to be smarter than you in the room without either of you getting defensive about it. Adrien found Maris exactly where Catherine had said, standing at his windows, looking out at the city with the particular stillness of someone who has been working very hard to look calm. She turned when she heard him. We won, he said. The relief that moved through her expression was profound and briefly unguarded, the kind of thing she would have controlled in any other moment, but which arrived now too quickly for management. Patricia and James, he continued. Marcus walked out. It's over, for now. Maris crossed the room, and before Adrien had fully processed what was happening, she had stepped forward and pulled him into a fierce, hard embrace. Her arms were tight around him, her face briefly pressed against his shoulder, and for a moment every careful professional distance of 3 years collapsed into simple human contact, two people who had just fought something difficult together and were still standing. Then she stepped back. Her hands stayed briefly on his arms, and her composure returned not because she was hiding, but because she chose it. Thank you, she said quietly, for not backing down, for not finding the easier path. Her eyes were clear and direct and carrying something she wasn't quite saying, for choosing the hard right over the easy wrong. I couldn't do anything else, he said, and then more quietly, you were worth it. This was worth it. The space between them held something that had no professional name. Maris's hands dropped from his arms. She stepped back one small, deliberate step, and in her expression, he watched her work through something. The same careful calculation she applied to everything important, arriving at a decision he could see forming, but not yet read. Adrien, she said, we need to talk. Not right now. Not today, while we're both running on adrenaline and the whole office is watching through the glass. She gestured slightly toward the outer office, where 2 analysts had found very important reasons to be at their desks. But soon, she paused, about several things. I know, he said. Patricia wasn't wrong. I know that too. She held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she nodded with the small, decisive quality of someone marking a checkpoint. Dinner, he said. Tonight. Somewhere that doesn't require us to perform for anyone. The pizzeria, she said immediately. The pizzeria. She returned to her desk. He returned to his office. And the ordinary machinery of the afternoon resumed emails, answered calls, returned the daily operations of an $8 billion company, proceeding with the indifference to human drama that large organizations reliably demonstrate. But something had changed in the architecture of the day. Something invisible and structural, the way a building changes when a load-bearing element finally settles into its intended position. At 6 o'clock, the office emptied. At 6:15, Adrien put on his jacket, picked up his phone, and walked to Maris's desk, where she was finishing the last of her day with characteristic efficiency. Ready? He asked. She saved her work, closed her tablet, and stood. There's one more thing, she said, and her voice had shifted into the register she used for important things. Before dinner, before the conversation I want to have. She reached into her desk drawer and placed a sealed envelope on the surface between them. He looked at it without touching it. "It's not my resignation," she said, reading his expression with accuracy. "It's not anything urgent. It's just—" She paused. "It's a question I've been writing and rewriting for 3 weeks. About the future. About what I want my role here to look like going forward. About whether the structure we've been operating in still serves either of us." Her eyes were steady. "I want you to read it tonight, before we talk." He picked up the envelope. It was heavier than it looked. "Okay, he said. They walked out of Valecor's lobby together into the evening air, and the city received them with its ordinary indifference, taxis and wind, and the distant sound of a bridge, and neither of them spoke because some things needed to be said in the right place, with the right amount of space around them. And they had learned over 3 years of working side by side that timing was everything. The envelope sat in Adrien's jacket pocket, all the way to the restaurant, its weight a physical reminder of the question that had been forming between them for longer than either of them had been willing to name. And at the corner table in the back of a narrow pizzeria on a block that time had somehow overlooked with checkered tablecloths and photographs of old neighborhoods on every wall. Two people who had spent 3 years learning each other from the careful distance of professional necessity finally sat down to figure out what came next. Sal brought water without being asked, and disappeared into the kitchen with the discretion of a man who understood that some evenings required space more than service. Adrien set the envelope on the table between them. It sat there in the candlelight cream-colored, sealed his name written on the front in Maris's precise, unhurried handwriting. Not a dramatic gesture, not a performance, just a document like the hundreds of documents she'd prepared for him over 3 years, except that this one had taken 3 weeks to write and contained something that had nothing to do with company business. "Before I open this, he said, "I want to say something." Maris, who had been looking at the envelope, looked up. "Today, the board meeting, the vote. All of it. I want to be clear that I didn't fight that battle because of what's in that envelope. I fought it because it was right, because Marcus was wrong, because Valecor's values have always been about merit over legacy, and backing down would have been a betrayal of everything the company actually stands for." He paused. "I don't want you to read whatever comes next as something I did for you. I need you to know I did it because it was the only defensible thing to do." Maris was quiet for a moment. "I know the difference," she said. "I've been watching you make decisions for 3 years. I know when you're being strategic and when you're being principled. Today you were both, which is rare than most people manage." She gestured slightly toward the envelope. "Open it." He broke the seal. The letter was 2 pages handwritten in the same careful script as his name on the front. He recognized immediately that she had written it multiple times before this version. There was the particular evenness of words that have been chosen after being rejected the quality of language that has been edited down to what it actually means. He read it once. Then he read it again slowly. Maris watched him read it the way she watched most things, without visible anxiety, with complete attention. When he set it down, the candle between them had burned a 1/4 inch lower, and Sal had brought bread without either of them noticing. "You're offering to resign," Adrien said. "I'm offering to choose to resign," Maris corrected. "There's a difference. The first is something that happens to you. The second is a decision I make about what I want my life to look like going forward." She leaned forward slightly, her forearms on the table. 3 weeks ago, before the gala, before any of this, I had already been thinking about it. The letter was half written before you ever asked me to that event. Why? Because I had outgrown the role. She said it without apology or drama, the way she said true things. Not the work I loved the work, but the structure, the title, the way it required me to be a particular kind of invisible in order to function effectively. Her eyes were steady. "I'm 34 years old. I built a healthcare initiative that will serve 50,000 children. I have 15 job offers on my phone right now. And every morning I come into that office and make myself smaller than I am because executive assistant is printed on my business card, and there are rules about how that category of person is supposed to exist in corporate spaces." She paused. "I'm tired of the rules." Adrien looked at the letter. "You've listed 3 options." "I have. Walk me through them." Maris straightened slightly, the posture of someone moving from personal to analytical, which for her was not a retreat, but a different kind of honesty. Option 1, I stay at Valecore in a different capacity, a senior operational role commensurate with my actual skill set. It solves the title problem, removes the subordinate dynamic, creates a cleaner professional structure. She paused. But it doesn't solve the underlying issue, which is that the board and the social circle that's been gunning for you will always be able to point to me as an internal complication. Every decision you make that benefits a project I'm involved with becomes potential ammunition. The conflict of interest argument doesn't disappear because my title changes. Option 2, Adrien said. I leave Valecore entirely. Take one of the consulting offers or build my own practice. Remove the professional entanglement completely. It's the cleanest solution from a corporate governance standpoint. It also happens to be the most personally costly because I've spent 3 years building something real inside that company, and walking away from it feels like... She stopped. Chose the honest word. Like loss. Even if it's the right loss. He looked at her. And option 3. Maris was quiet for a moment. The candlelight moved between them. Option 3 is the one I almost didn't write down, she said, because it requires saying out loud what we've been carefully not saying for long enough that it's become its own kind of habit. She met his eyes directly. Option 3 is that we acknowledge what's actually happening between us, that I leave Valecore not as a professional recalibration, but as a deliberate choice to remove the one barrier that makes everything else complicated, and that we see with full honesty and no performance whether what exists between us is something worth building. The restaurant moved quietly around them. Somewhere near the front, a couple was laughing about something. Sal was visible through the kitchen pass-through, moving with the unhurried rhythm of someone who had been doing this work for decades. You said you almost didn't write it down, Adrien said. Because it's frightening, Maris said simply. Not the leaving I can leave. Not even the uncertainty of starting something new. What's frightening is saying clearly to you in a place where you can't mistake what I mean. I have feelings for you that are not professional, that have not been professional for some time, that I have managed with considerable effort because the alternative was not available to me inside the structure we were operating in. She looked at him without looking away. Saying that out loud removes the option of pretending it isn't true. And once it's real, once we've named it, we can't go back to the version of things where I hand you your coffee and pretend the weight of what I'm actually thinking isn't there. Adrien set the letter down carefully, the way you set down something you intend to keep. I told Patricia today, he said, that my personal feelings were irrelevant to my ability to run the company. I know, Catherine told me. It was true as far as it went. My feelings haven't compromised a single business decision. I'm confident of that. He paused. But it was also incomplete. Because you asked me once sitting in my office the night I asked you to the gala, you asked me why it mattered so much to me, and I told you it was because I was tired of being alone in crowds. He looked at her across the table. That was true, but it wasn't everything. Maris waited. I wanted you there because I'm in love with you, he said. I think I've been in love with you for the better part of a year, and have been telling myself a very elaborate story about why that was an impossible and inadvisable thing to be, about power dynamics and professional ethics, and the ammunition it would give people like Marcus. He paused. All of which are real concerns, none of which changed anything. The candle burned between them. I know, Maris said softly. You knew. I suspected. There's a difference. A pause. I hoped. That's different from both. Adrien exhaled slowly, the breath of someone who has been holding something a long time and is finally permitted to set it down. So what do? We do option 3, Maris said. Carefully, with full awareness of what it costs and what it risks and what it could become if we're honest enough to build it right. She leaned forward slightly. I give my notice Friday, 2 weeks professional and clean. Catherine gets advance notice so she can manage the HR implications properly. I take the position at Thornton Consulting. They've been asking for months. It's genuinely good work, and it puts me on equal professional footing with no reporting structure between us. She paused. And then we wait a reasonable amount of time before we're seen together socially. Long enough that it looks like a natural development, not like confirmation of everything Marcus has been implying. How long? 6 weeks? 8. Long enough for the board meeting to fade from the top of the news cycle. long enough for my departure to read as a career move rather than a response to pressure. She held his gaze, and during that time we're honest with each other. Not publicly, but privately. No more managing what we actually think and feel inside a professional framework that wasn't built to hold it. Adrien turned the letter over in his hands. You planned all of this. I planned the structure, she said. I have no idea what happens inside it. That's the part I can't control, which is also the part that matters most. For the first time all evening, something uncertain moved through her expression, real and unguarded in the way that things are when they're genuinely felt rather than performed. I'm not asking you to make promises, Adrien. I'm not asking for declarations. I'm asking you to be willing to try, to be present and honest and patient with what we're building, because I have spent... She stopped, and her voice was steady but careful, the way it was when she was carrying something heavy. I have spent years watching people treat each other as instruments, as means to ends, as accessories or assets or obstacles. And I have wanted for a very long time something that was simply real, whatever that looks like, whatever it costs. She met his eyes. I think you want that too. I do, he said. I've wanted it so long I'd almost stopped believing I was capable of it. You're capable of it. No hesitation, no softening, just the flat, certain honesty that was the most distinctly her thing about her. You've been practicing it every time you treated me like a person instead of a function. Every time you argued for something you believed was right instead of something that was safe. Every time you stayed in that office until 8 o'clock, not because the work required it, but because... She stopped. Because you were there, he said quietly. Because I was there, she agreed. Sal appeared with the pizza, unhurried, unobtrusive, setting it down between them, with the ease of someone who had no idea he was interrupting the most important conversation two people at this table had ever had, or possibly did know, and simply respected the rhythm of it. They ate. The conversation shifted not away from what had been said, but around it, the way you move around something significant, letting it exist without constantly pointing at it. They talked about Thornton Consulting, about the work Maris was genuinely excited to do there. They talked about Valecor's upcoming product launch and what it would need from leadership over the next quarter. They talked about the healthcare initiative's expansion timeline, about the city council member who had approached Maris at the Gala, about what sustainable growth for the program actually required. Ordinary conversation. The kind that builds a life. An hour in, Maris set down her slice and looked at him with the expression she used when she had finished processing something. I need you to understand something about option 3, about choosing this. Tell me. I'm not leaving Valecor for you, she said. I want to be precise about that because I think the story you might tell yourself, the story people like Richard and Marcus will definitely tell, is that I've been strategically positioning myself, and this is the culmination of a plan. Or that I'm making a sacrifice for a relationship which positions me as someone who gave things up rather than someone who chose things. She looked at him steadily. I'm leaving Valecor for me, because I've outgrown it, because I have more to offer than the role allows, because I built a $12 million healthcare program in my spare time, and it's probably time to stop treating my actual ambition as a side project. A pause. The fact that leaving also creates the space for something real between us that's not a sacrifice. That's two things being true at once. Two things being true at once, Adrien repeated. It's possible, Maris said, to leave a job you're good at and to want a life that's bigger than the job. Neither thing diminishes the other. He thought about that. About the story he'd been telling himself for years, that the company was the point. That achievement was the accumulation, that everything personal was secondary to the professional because the professional was quantifiable and the personal was not. About standing at his penthouse windows feeling the hollow weight of everything he'd built and could not name. When did you figure out how to think this clearly? He asked, around the time I stopped asking for permission to think at all. She almost smiled. It's remarkable what becomes possible when you stop performing for an audience that was never going to applaud you anyway. He looked at her across the table. This woman he had worked beside for 3 years, whom he had watched make herself invisible in order to survive, who had quietly built a program that would save children's lives, who had stood in a ballroom of 300 hostile strangers and told the truth without flinching, and felt something shift in his chest with the weight and finality of something that has been deciding for a long time and is only now arriving. "Okay," he said. Maris raised an eyebrow. "Option 3, he said. "All of it, however long it takes to do it right." "You're sure?" "I've been building things my whole life by refusing to accept that the outcome was predetermined." He held her gaze. "I'm not going to start accepting it now." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her pizza and said with characteristic dryness, "Good. Because I've already started drafting my resignation letter, and it would be embarrassing to delete it." He laughed. The real laugh unguarded the one she'd been drawing out of him for 3 years without either of them quite acknowledging it. "What does it say?" "It's professional and gracious and contains absolutely nothing about what's actually happening." She considered. "Which is perhaps the most accurately representative document I've ever written for Valecore." They stayed until the restaurant was nearly empty, talking in the way that people talk when they've finally been given permission to stop being careful. About the future, not in declarations, but in the ordinary language of two people planning for something they expect to exist. About the apartment Maris had been thinking about leaving for a year. About the Thornton consulting project that excited her most. About the traveling she'd postponed and the books she'd been meaning to read, and the half-formed idea she had for expanding the healthcare initiative into a model that could be licensed to municipalities. About small things. The accumulation of which Adrien had been slowly learning was what a life was actually made of. It was past 11 when they finally stood to go. Sal emerged from the kitchen, accepted Adrien's handshake and Maris's genuine thanks, and held the door for them with the warmth of someone who had known this man for years and was pleased by what he was observing. Outside, the October night had gone properly cold. Maris's breath was visible in the lamplight. "Friday," she said. "Friday tsit," he confirmed. "And Adrien." She turned to face him on the sidewalk, and in the amber glow of the streetlight, her expression was clear and open, and carrying something he was only just beginning to let himself read. Whatever happens in the weeks after the waiting, the managing of appearances, the careful distance we're going to have to maintain in public, I need you to know that I'm not ambivalent. I'm not trying things out or keeping options open. She met his eyes. "I know what I want. I decided before I wrote the letter. The letter was just the evidence." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face. One slow, deliberate gesture that existed entirely outside the professional vocabulary of everything they'd been to each other for 3 years. "I know what I want too," he said. She didn't move away from the touch. "Then we're agreed." "We're agreed." He walked her to her door, and at the threshold she rose briefly on her toes and pressed her lips to his cheek close enough to the corner of his mouth that his breath caught warm enough that he felt it for the entire drive home. Not a promise, exactly, more like a marker. A point on a map that said, "Here. This is where we are. From here we go forward." Friday arrived with gray skies and the particular cold that settles in after the city has accepted that autumn is over. Maris walked into Adrien's office at 9 o'clock with her resignation letter and set it on his desk with both hands, the way you set down something you've been carrying a long time. He stood to accept it. 2 weeks, she said. Her voice was steady. Her eyes were clear. "I've documented all ongoing projects and created transition protocols for Jennifer. Catherine has the HR paperwork." He held the envelope. Neither of them moved for a moment. "You're sure?" he said. "I'm choosing it," she said, "which is better than sure." He set the envelope down and held out his hand. She shook it, a deliberate echo of every professional exchange they'd made across this desk, and also something more, the formal acknowledgement of one thing ending so that another could begin. "Thank you," he said, "for 3 years of exceptional work." "Thank you," she said, "for being worth working for." She returned to her desk and the morning proceeded and the office moved through its ordinary rhythms without knowing that something had fundamentally changed in the architecture of two lives inside it. Catherine appeared at 10, closed the door, and sat across from Adrien with the expression of someone who has put several things together. "She told me this morning," Catherine said. "I know. I need to ask you directly for the record whether the resignation is voluntary and uncoerced." "Entirely voluntary. She'd been considering it before the gala." Catherine nodded slowly. And the other part is not yet anything, Adrien said, and won't be until she's been gone long enough that the transition is clearly complete. 6 weeks minimum, Catherine said. 8 is better. The board is still watching. I know. Catherine was quiet for a moment. Adrien. Her voice shifted, less official, more human. When I took this job, I told myself I'd leave the first time I felt like I was working for someone I couldn't respect. I've been here 5 years. She stood collecting her folder. Don't let people like Marcus convince you that wanting something real is a liability. It's the only thing that makes any of this. She gestured broadly at the office, the company, the view, the whole elaborate edifice of Valecore Technologies. Worth it. She left him alone with the letter and the morning light, and the 8 weeks stretching out ahead of him, long and necessary, and already somehow full of something he hadn't felt in a very long time. The 2 weeks of Maris's transition passed with bittersweet efficiency. She trained Jennifer with the same thoroughness she brought to everything, comprehensive, precise, generous, with knowledge she had spent 3 years accumulating. She documented processes that had lived in her head, mapped the invisible architecture of understanding she'd built around Adrien's working style, created reference materials that would allow anyone competent to step into the mechanical requirements of the role. What she couldn't document was the rest. The instinctive read of when he needed pushing versus when he needed space. The particular way she could tell from his posture across a conference table whether he was genuinely persuaded by an argument or performing persuasion. The 3 years of accumulated knowledge about what he actually meant when he said things which was frequently different from what he said. Those things went with her when she left, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said so. On her last day, the office held a small warm goodbye colleagues, expressing genuine regret. A few people admitting they'd underestimated her, the particular quality of appreciation that arrives slightly too late, but means something anyway. Adrien spoke briefly and professionally, thanking her for her service, wishing her success, saying nothing about the weight of what was changing or the envelope in his desk drawer that he'd read 4 more times since Friday. When the gathering broke up and the office returned to its afternoon business, Maris packed the last box from her desk. 2 books, a small succulent in a terracotta pot, a framed photograph of her grandmother, a small woman with a direct expression and nurse's hands caught in the light of some ordinary afternoon. She stood at her desk for a moment after the box was full. Adrien watched from his doorway. That's everything, she said, and her voice was composed in the way that things are composed when they're working at it. He walked across the office to where she stood. 3 years, he said. 3 years, she agreed. They looked at each other across the cleaned-out desk, the empty surface that had been the staging ground of 100 conversations, 1,000 tasks, 3 years of carefully maintained professional distance that had somehow, in the maintenance of it, become its own kind of intimacy. I'll see you in 8 weeks, he said, quietly, just for her. The composure held, but something in her eyes went briefly and completely unguarded. 7, she said. I'm counting from next Monday. He almost smiled. 7 weeks, then. Catherine appeared at the edge of the space folder in hand, her timing as precise as always. Ready, Maris? I'll walk you out. Maris picked up her box. She looked at Adrien one final time, the look of someone memorizing a point in space, fixing it in place, so that when they return to it, they'll recognize where they are. Then she turned and walked out of his office, and the sound of her heels on the marble floor diminished down the hallway and around the corner, and the space she left behind was both smaller and larger than it had been before. Adrien returned to his desk. His phone buzzed 40 minutes later. Maris Thornton called while I was in the elevator. They want me to start a project in 3 weeks. It involves redesigning the operational structure of a mid-size healthcare company. He stared at the message, then typed, Of course it does. Maris, I told them I was interested. Also, I took the succulent. Adrien, I noticed. Maris, it was mine. Adrien, I know. I just liked having it there. A pause. Then Maris, 7 weeks. He set down his phone and the office was quiet around him, and the city moved through its afternoon below, and somewhere across town, a woman with a box of books and a photograph of her grandmother and a small plant in a terracotta pot was walking into the next chapter of her life with the same calm certainty she brought to everything. 7 weeks. He could survive 7 weeks. He turned to his computer and opened the Valecore performance report and got back to work, And the company ran, and the city moved, and the weeks began to pass. And every morning he arrived at an office where Jennifer was competent and efficient and professional and not Maris. And he was fair to her in every way and honest with himself about why the difference mattered. 3 weeks and Marcus Vandermeer resigned from the board. The official statement cited philosophical differences about leadership direction. Patricia sent Adrien a one-line text, "Told you." Catherine drafted a press release that was gracious and said nothing. James Morrison called personally to say that Marcus's departure was long overdue and that Valecore was better for it, which was the most words James had ever directed at Adrien in a single phone call. 4 weeks in the gossip columns moved on to something else entirely. The social circles that had spent October dissecting the Harrington Gala found new material, new drama, new reasons to perform outrage and solidarity in equal measure. Adrien's name appeared in the business press only in connection with Valecore's quarterly results, which were exceptional, and an industry award which he accepted via video message because he had a product launch that week, and priorities. 5 weeks in, Maris texted him a photograph. It was the succulent sitting on a window ledge in what was apparently her new office at Thornton Consulting in afternoon light, looking healthy and entirely unbothered by the change of address. Maris, it's thriving. He looked at the photograph for a long time. Adrien, so am I, he typed. And then, because it was true and they had agreed to be honest, but it would be going better if it were 6 weeks instead of 5. Her response took a moment. Maris, 2 more weeks. Adrien, I know. Maris, then we find out if all of this was worth it. He thought about the board meeting and the gala and the envelope on the pizzeria table and the way she'd said option 3 with the certainty of someone who had already made peace with the risk before she named it. Adrien, it already is, he typed. This time her response was immediate. Maris, yes, she wrote, it already is. The call came on a Tuesday morning, 7 weeks and 2 days after Maris had walked out of Valecore's lobby with a box of books and a succulent plant. Adrien was in a product review meeting when his phone lit up with her name. He excused himself with the particular calm of a man who had been waiting for something long enough that its arrival felt more like relief than surprise, stepped into the hallway, and answered before the second ring. Hi, he said. Hi. Her voice carried warmth that professional calls had never allowed, and even through the phone he could hear the smile underneath it. So I was thinking about dinner tonight. I've been thinking about dinner tonight for 7 weeks. 2 weeks ago you said 6. I was rounding down. He leaned against the hallway wall, aware that he was smiling in a way that was probably visible from the conference room. Where? Aurelio's, she said. Somewhere public enough to be seen, private enough for actual conversation. A pause. Adrien, I'm done with careful distance. Tonight isn't 2 colleagues catching up. Tonight is a first date, real and public and intentional. He felt something loosen in his chest, the last of the tension that had been living there since the night she'd walked out of his office carrying her grandmother's photograph. I'll pick you up at 7. It's a date, Maris said. And then, don't be late. I've waited long enough. He went back into the meeting and was present for approximately 40% of it. He left the office at 5 o'clock, which prompted Jennifer to ask with careful neutrality whether everything was all right. He told her everything was excellent. She looked at his expression and seemed to believe him. He spent 30 minutes selecting a suit, which was 29 minutes longer than he typically spent on such decisions, and another 20 choosing flowers, which was 20 minutes longer than he'd spent on anything floral in his entire adult life. The florist, a small woman who had been arranging flowers on this corner for longer than Valecore had existed, looked at what he was describing and said, without being asked, traditional is underrated. It means you paid attention. He paid attention. At 7 precisely, his car pulled up to Maris's building. She emerged wearing a dress the color of deep wine, not the emerald gown of the Harrington Gala, not the professional charcoal suits of 3 years of office mornings, but something that was entirely and simply herself. Her hair was down. She moved with the ease of someone who had made peace with being seen. She looked at the flowers, and something genuinely surprised moved across her face. Not performed delight, but the real thing, which was rare and better. "You brought flowers," she said. "I paid attention," he said. She accepted them, and when she looked up from them, her eyes were clear and direct and carrying everything they'd spent 7 weeks not quite saying. "Ready?" he asked. "More than—" she said. Aurelio's was exactly what Adrien had intended, upscale Italian warm lighting, the kind of ambient discretion that made it suitable for business dinners and meaningful ones in equal measure. The maitre d' recognized him immediately and led them to a corner table with the unhurried professionalism of someone who understood that certain evenings required a certain kind of space. They settled across from each other, menus open and ignored, and for a moment neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was so much that they were both for once content to simply be in it. "Nervous?" Maris asked. "Terrified to," Adrien said, "which is ridiculous because I've closed deals worth hundreds of millions and stared down a hostile board and survived a congressional investigation, and none of those things made my hands sweat the way sitting across from you at a restaurant does. It's scarier because it matters more," she said. The same thing she'd told him weeks ago, but hearing it now in this context, it landed differently, like a thing proven rather than predicted. "Yes," he said, "exactly that." She reached across the table and took his hand openly, without hesitation, the way she did everything she'd decided to do. The contact was both familiar and completely new. 3 years of carefully maintained professional distance made this simple gesture feel like the crossing of something significant. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Before we order, before we talk about anything else. Tell me." "I've been doing work I'm proud of at Thornton," she said. "Real work, meaningful work, the kind that uses everything I have instead of the fraction that fit inside the previous structure. And I'm good. I'm genuinely good. I'm not saying this because I want you to feel that leaving Valecore cost me something it didn't." She paused. "I'm saying it because I need you to know that I'm here tonight, not from need or loss, or because one door closed and this was what remained. I'm here because I chose this, because you're what I want when I have every option available." Her hand tightened slightly on his. "I wanted to say that clearly on the record at the beginning." Adrien looked at her for a long moment. "You know what I keep thinking about?" he said. "The night in the office when I asked you to the gala. You said you'd been choosing invisibility because it was safer than visibility, and I remember thinking I understood what you meant." He paused. "I didn't. Not fully. I understand it now." "What changed?" "You showed me what it cost," he said simply, "and then you showed me what it looked like to stop paying it. And somewhere in watching you do that, I realized I'd been doing my own version of the same thing, building the company, accumulating the achievements, maintaining the social performances. All of it was a different kind of invisibility, hiding the actual person inside the billionaire CEO so thoroughly that I'd almost lost track of who he was." Maris studied him with the attention she gave to things that deserved it. "And now I'm sitting across from the person who can tell the difference," he said, "which is either terrifying or the best thing that's ever happened to me." "Both," she said, "simultaneously. That's how you know it's real." They ordered wine and pasta and talked for 3 hours the way they'd always talked at their best, without performance or agenda covering ground that ranged from the serious to the absurd, with the ease of people who had spent years building a common language without realizing that was what they were doing. Maris told him about the Thornton Project, a regional healthcare company whose operational inefficiencies were costing them patience as much as money, and the satisfaction of identifying exactly where the system was breaking and designing something that would actually fix it. She talked about the expansion plan for her initiative, now moving into 2 additional cities with the support of the Harrington Foundation and 3 partners she'd cultivated over the past 2 months. Adrien told her about the product launch, the one that had gone better than projected, better than anything Valecore had released in 2 years, and the particular quiet pride of watching his team take something from concept to market, and do it well. He told her about a conversation he'd had with Patricia Thornwell the previous week, in which Patricia had said with characteristic directness that the board was stronger without Marcus, and that she'd been wrong to frame certain things the way she had. "She apologized?" Maris asked. "Patricia doesn't apologize," Adrien said. "She revises her assessment and communicates the revision, which is functionally the same thing but sounds more like a strategy memo. Maris laughed the real laugh, the one that built from somewhere genuine. I've always liked Patricia. She likes you too. She told me at the last board meeting that she'd received your consulting proposal for the foundation's operational review and that it was, and I'm quoting, the most coherent strategic document she'd read in 3 years. She hired me, Maris said. Adrien stared. She hired you and didn't tell me. She hired me last week. The engagement starts in January. Maris's expression carried the particular brightness of someone who has been waiting to deliver good news. I'll be working with the Harrington Foundation on implementing the healthcare initiative's expansion model across their partner organizations. It's a 6-month contract, and Patricia specifically said, she paused, her smile widening. She specifically said she was tired of working with people who prioritized optics over outcomes, and that she wanted someone who would tell her when she was wrong. And you told her you were available. I told her I was exactly that person. Adrien shook his head slowly, feeling something that was more than pride and less than surprise. The specific emotion of watching someone you've always known was exceptional finally occupy the full dimensions of their capability. You're going to change how that foundation operates. That's the intention, she said. Also, for what it's worth, Patricia told me when we met to discuss the contract that she'd been thinking about what I said to her at the gala, about the board meeting. What did you say to her at the gala? I didn't hear that conversation. She pulled me aside after your defense just before we left. She said she'd been wrong about a few things and wanted me to know it. Maris looked at him steadily. And I told her that the most powerful thing a person in her position could do was use her influence to change the conditions that made evenings like that gala necessary in the first place. That she sat on 6 boards and controlled enormous philanthropic capital, and that every event she attended where someone was treated the way I was treated that night was an event she could have changed. What did she say? She said she'd think about it. Maris paused. And then she hired me to redesign her foundation's operations. So I think she thought about it. The restaurant had thinned around them, the early diners replaced by the later ones, the ambient noise settling into the quieter register of a weeknight winding down. Adrien signaled for dessert, which they shared tiramisu, feeding each other bites with the casual intimacy of people who have stopped performing for an audience and are simply being with each other. It was during this fork halfway across the table that Adrien noticed Vivienne Lassier moving through the restaurant. She saw them at the same moment he saw her. The calculation happened in real time across her face, the assessment, the decision, the arrangement of expression into whatever would serve her best. She changed course toward their table with the smooth inevitability of a woman who had decided that the most powerful position was the one she initiated. Adrien. Air kisses practiced and automatic. Then, with the particular quality of someone who has revised their script since the last performance, Maris, I heard you've left Valecore. The consulting world's gain, I suppose. That's generous, Maris said pleasantly. How are you, Vivienne? The question landed slightly wrong for Vivienne, who had been prepared for something she could parry. Genuine inquiry was harder. I'm well, thank you. I've actually been meaning to reach out. The literacy program you mentioned at the gala, I've been thinking about it. I'd like to understand the evaluation metrics better, whether the model is replicable. Maris studied her for a moment with the calm assessment of someone deciding how honest to be. It is replicable, Maris said. I've written a framework document that outlines the structural requirements. If you're genuinely interested in implementation rather than association, I'm happy to share it. My office can send it to you. I'd appreciate that. Vivienne's expression had shifted not into warmth exactly, but into something that was at least attempting sincerity. I know that the last time we spoke, I was... She stopped, chose words with unusual care. I was operating on assumptions I shouldn't have made. I'd like the chance to be more useful. Then be useful, Maris said. Not unkindly, simply. The framework will tell you exactly what that looks like. The children the program serves don't require anyone to have been right from the beginning. They require people to be effective going forward. Vivienne nodded a real nod without the social lacquer that usually coated her gestures. I'll look for your office's email. She looked between them, and whatever she saw in the way they were sitting together, the easy intimacy of shared dessert and unhurried conversation made her expression do something complicated. You both look well, she said. And then she continued through the restaurant, and Adrien watched her go with the sense of watching someone genuinely recalibrate. That was different, he said. People change when the conditions change, Maris said, picking up her fork. She's not a fundamentally terrible person. She's a person who was operating inside a system that rewarded the behavior she was displaying. Change what the system rewards, and some people adjust. A pause. Not all of them, but some. Richard won't. No, she agreed. Richard is genuinely committed to being exactly who he is, but he's also becoming increasingly irrelevant, and relevance was the only thing he ever actually cared about, so that's its own resolution. Adrien looked at her across the table. You've thought about all of these people. I've had 7 weeks of waiting, she said dryly. I thought about a lot of things. They left Aurelio's hand in hand, and Adrien felt the quality of public attention that followed them out. A few heads turning, the particular awareness of being observed by people who recognized him and were calibrating what they were seeing. He had spent years managing that attention, positioning himself within it, using it as a tool or deflecting it as a liability depending on the situation. Tonight he simply walked through it with Maris's hand in his and let people see exactly what was there. In the car, she leaned her head briefly against his shoulder, the same unself-conscious ease she'd been moving through the entire evening, the quality of someone who had made a decision and was living inside it rather than performing it. Tell me something, he said as they moved through the city. What do you want to know? The moment you realized. He kept his eyes on the road. Not when you suspected, not when you started managing it. The actual moment you knew. She was quiet for a moment. The city moved past outside. About a year ago, she said. You came in on a Thursday morning, you'd been in London for the week, you'd landed at 6, and come directly to the office, you hadn't slept more than 3 hours. And you had a 9 o'clock with the legal team about the regulatory filing, which was genuinely important and required you to be sharp. She paused. And instead of going directly into your office to review the materials, you stopped at my desk and asked how the situation with my buildings management company had resolved. I'd mentioned it in passing 2 weeks earlier, a noise complaint, nothing significant. You'd been in another country for 6 days, you were running on no sleep. You had 30 minutes before a meeting that mattered, and you stopped to ask about a minor inconvenience in my personal life because you'd been carrying it in your head for 2 weeks and wanted to know it had been resolved. Adrien said nothing. It was such a small thing, Maris said. That's what I kept telling myself afterward. It's a small thing. It doesn't mean anything. People ask polite follow-up questions. But I knew the difference. I'd been watching you interact with people for 3 years. I knew what your polite professional inquiries looked like, and I knew what it looked like when you were actually paying attention. She turned to look at him. You were actually paying attention. You had been for a long time. And I drove home that night and sat in my apartment and allowed myself to know something I'd been very carefully not knowing. He was quiet for a moment. The noise complaint was resolved, by the way. I know, she said. I'm the one who told you. I know, I just wanted to confirm that I was justified in carrying it for 2 weeks. She laughed, and the sound of it filled the car, and the city moved past outside. And Adrien thought about the years he'd spent standing at penthouse windows, feeling the hollow weight of everything he'd built, and felt the contrast of this moment with an intensity that made it difficult to speak. Maris, he said. Yes. I want to build something with you. I don't mean professionally, though. I believe what we can build professionally would be extraordinary. I mean a life, the actual thing. Shared mornings and difficult conversations, and all the ordinary accumulated weight of 2 people choosing each other in the unremarkable moments as well as the significant ones. He kept his voice steady. I know we've just started. I know 7 weeks of waiting and 1 dinner doesn't constitute a declaration of anything, but I want you to know the direction I'm moving in so there's no ambiguity, so you have full information and can plan accordingly, which I know is how you prefer to operate. You're proposing a long-term strategic partnership, she said. I'm telling you I'm in love with you, and I'd like to see where that goes. She was quiet for a beat. Both of those things can be true simultaneously. Both of those things are true simultaneously. She reached across and covered his hand on the gear shift. I know the direction I'm moving in too, she said. Have known it for longer than tonight. A pause. So we're agreed. We're agreed. They drove the rest of the way to her apartment in the comfortable silence that had always been one of the truest things between them. The particular ease of two people who had stopped needing to fill the space with performance and were simply finally in it together. The months that followed were the kind that don't announce themselves as significant while they're happening, but reveal their weight in retrospect. They went to dinner at places that mattered to both of them, and places that mattered to neither of them, and found that the location was never quite the point. They walked through the city on Sunday mornings with coffee and no agenda. They argued about things worth arguing about, the pace of the healthcare initiative's expansion, the balance between Adrien's instinct for bold moves and Maris's preference for structural soundness, the question of what ambition looked like when it was oriented towards something other than proving a point. And the arguments were the good kind, the kind that sharpened thinking rather than diminished people. Maris's work at Thornton Consulting generated the kind of results that generate their own momentum. The healthcare company she'd restructured reduced its patient wait times by 40% in the first quarter. The Harrington Foundation's operational review delivered to Patricia Thornwell in January resulted in what Patricia described to three separate board members as the most useful document I've received in a decade of philanthropic work. The initiative's expansion into new cities moved ahead of schedule, and in March, Maris stood in a community center in a neighborhood that had been systematically underserved for 40 years and watched a child receive a diabetes screening that 3 years earlier would have required a bus ride and a half day of waiting. She called Adrien from the parking lot afterward, and he heard in her voice something he recognized as the specific quality of meaning that couldn't be manufactured. The real thing arrived at through actual work, not performance. How is she? He asked. 7 years old, Maris said. Her name is Lily. She has her grandmother's eyes, apparently, though I have no way of knowing if that's true. A pause. She's going to be fine, because she came in before it mattered, and she came in because we built something that made it possible for her to come in. Her voice was steady, but he could hear the weight it was carrying. That's what it looks like. I needed to see it in person. I know, he said. That's why you went. Yes. Are you okay? Better than okay, she said. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. The Spring Philanthropy Summit came in April, and this time the invitation was addressed to both of them. Not Adrien Vale with a +1, but Adrien Vale and Maris Bennett, their names printed together on the heavy cardstock with the simple equality of people whose individual significance had been separately established. Maris wore a gown that shimmered like starlight, expensive, bold, unapologetically itself. She wore the diamond earrings Adrien had given her for no particular occasion, except that he'd seen them in a window and thought of her, which he'd told her, and which she'd accepted without performing either false modesty or excessive gratitude, which was exactly how she accepted things. They arrived at the summit to find it already in motion, and the quality of attention they received was different from anything the Harrington Gala had offered. People approached Maris with genuine purpose. Foundation directors wanting to discuss the operational model, a senator who had read the policy brief. Her initiative had generated a healthcare CEO who had implemented 3 of her framework's recommendations and wanted to tell her the results. They approached Adrien with the recalibrated respect of people who had watched him hold his position under significant pressure and had drawn conclusions. Nobody treated them as a novelty. Nobody whispered. The work had made that impossible. During the summit's recognition ceremony, when the organizers announced the Emerging Impact Award and read the description of the recipients' work, the mobile clinics, the telemedicine infrastructure, the education programs, the 50,000 children in the first year now expanded to 3 cities and counting and called Maris to the stage. The applause that met her was immediate and genuine and did not contain the quality of people recalibrating their assessment mid-clap. They had already recalibrated. They were simply responding to what they saw. Maris accepted the award and stood at the podium, and she looked out at the room with the same clear steadiness she brought to everything. And she spoke about the 9-year-old girl who had died and about her grandmother who had driven a second-hand car across 4 counties, and about the difference between caring about something and being effective about something. And when she said the children who will benefit from this program don't need our applause, they need our action. It was not a performance. It was a fact. Afterward on the terrace, Adrien stood beside her in the cool April evening and watched the city lights spread out below them. The same city, the same lights, the same view. He'd been standing at windows observing for years, feeling the hollow weight of something unnamed. "No regrets?" Maris asked. She leaned against him with the easy comfort of months of choosing each other, her shoulder against his arm, her voice quiet in the night air. "Not one," he said. "You?" She considered the question with the seriousness she gave to things that deserved it. "I regret the years I spent making myself small," she said. "Not because they were wasted, they taught me things I needed to know, but because I believed for a long time that the cost of visibility was higher than I could afford. And I was wrong." She turned to look at him. "The cost of invisibility was higher. I just didn't know how to calculate it until I stopped paying it." He put his arm around her and she settled against him, and below them the city moved through its evening in complete indifference to the fact that two people on a terrace had figured something out that most people spent their whole lives trying to find. "I want to ask you something," Adrien said. "Ask." He reached into his jacket pocket. He'd been carrying the ring for 2 weeks, waiting for a moment that felt honest rather than staged. Not a grand gesture designed for an audience, but a real question asked in a real place between two real people. This terrace, this evening, this woman. He turned to face her and she looked at him with the full, unguarded attention she reserved for things that mattered. And he held out the ring simple and precise and exactly her, a single stone that caught the city light and returned it. "I had a speech," he said, "about what you've given me and what we've built and what I believe about the future. But standing here, I keep reducing it to the same thing." He met her eyes. "I want to build a life with you. The whole thing. Every ordinary day and every impossible one. I want to choose you in all the unremarkable moments, not just the significant ones, because that's where a life actually happens. I want to be the person you call from a parking lot when you've just watched something move you. I want to argue with you about strategy and be wrong often enough to stay honest." He paused. "I want to be present for whatever comes next, with you, for as long as you'll have me." Maris looked at the ring and then at him, and he watched the composure she maintained so expertly and so constantly. Do something he'd seen it do only a handful of times in the years he'd known her. Not break, but soften genuinely and completely into the expression of someone who has allowed themselves to feel what they actually feel. Her eyes were bright. "Yes," she said. Her voice was steady because she was Maris, and her voice was always steady, but it was also carrying everything she meant by the word and did not need to enumerate. Yes to all of it, the ordinary days especially. He slid the ring onto her finger and she looked at it for a moment, thoughtful, present, already incorporating it into the inventory of what was real, and then she stepped forward and kissed him on that terrace above the city that had watched them fight for this, and the city moved on below them in its indifferent and ceaseless way. And it didn't matter that it didn't notice because they noticed, and that was enough. The wedding was in June, 6 months later. Small and deliberate 40 people who actually mattered in a garden at the hour when the afternoon light turns amber and the city's noise softens into something almost gentle. Patricia Thornwell attended, and Catherine Chen and Sal from the pizzeria, who arrived in a suit that suggested he had not worn one in several years and did not mind. James Morrison came with his wife and spent most of the reception in conversation with Maris's grandmother's photograph, which she had framed and placed on a table with the other people they were honoring by being present. Richard Ashford was not there. Neither was Vivian Lassier, though she had sent flowers, an arrangement that was thoughtful enough to suggest she had paid more attention than expected, and a note that said simply, "The framework document was excellent. The program is working. Congratulations." Maris had read the note twice and set it on the table beside the flowers and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. They exchanged vows in the amber light in front of people who had watched this story unfold from its various vantage points, and the vows were honest in the way that things are honest when they've been composed by people who have spent time understanding exactly what they mean. Adrien said, "I choose you in the ordinary days, which is harder and more important than choosing you in the extraordinary ones. I choose your honesty even when it costs me something. I choose the person you are when nobody is watching, which is the same as the person you are when everyone is watching, and I have never met anyone else about whom that was true. Maris said I spent a long time believing that visibility was dangerous, that being fully seen was a risk I couldn't afford. You made it safe to be undeniable, not by protecting me from judgment, but by standing beside me while I learned to stop needing protection from it. For that, and for everything else, and for all the ordinary days ahead, I choose you. Sal cried, which surprised nobody who knew him. In the days and months and years that followed, the life they built looked from the outside like many things a merger of two significant professional presences, a philanthropic partnership that expanded the healthcare initiative into 7 cities, a marriage observed by people in their social and professional world as evidence that certain hierarchies were genuinely shifting. From the inside, it looked like something simpler and harder to name. It looked like two people who had learned to be visible, not performing their best selves, but actually being themselves with all the uncertainty and imprecision and ordinary grace that involved. It looked like arguments that ended in honesty. It looked like Sunday mornings with coffee and the newspaper and Maris's occasional observation that the succulent on the windowsill had achieved a kind of philosophical contentment she aspired to. It looked like Adrien leaving the office at 6 o'clock, not because the work was finished, but because the work was never finished, and there were better things than completion to orient a life around. It looked like the kind of thing that doesn't make headlines, which is precisely why it lasts. And in the city below the windows where Adrien had once stood pressing his palm against cold glass, feeling the hollow weight of everything he'd built and could not share in the offices and boardrooms and event spaces where people had once debated the appropriate social position of a woman who had made herself invisible in order to survive, something was changing. Not dramatically, not all at once, not in the clean and satisfying way that stories sometimes promise, but genuinely, incrementally, in the accumulation of small reckonings that eventually become something larger than any individual act. The Harrington Foundation changed how it evaluated philanthropic impact. Patricia Thornwell, at the following year's Gala, gave a speech about the difference between associating with excellence and actually creating conditions for it. A speech that several observers noted was unusually direct for the context, and which Patricia, when asked about its inspiration, attributed to a conversation she'd had on a terrace 2 years earlier with a woman whose name was on the building's new initiative wing. Richard Ashford, whose relevance had been quietly diminishing since the night he'd watched his social currency prove less durable than he'd imagined, eventually sold his stake in 2 companies and moved to a smaller life in a different city. Nobody discussed him much. That was the resolution he'd feared most and arrived at anyway. The children, the Lilies, and the 9-year-olds whose names would never appear in newspapers continued to receive care that had not existed before someone decided that systemic failure was not the same as inevitability. That more than anything was what it was all for. On a Tuesday evening in October, 1 year, almost to the day since an ordinary Tuesday evening when Adrien Vale had stood at his office window feeling the emptiness of a life built on transactions, he sat in the apartment they shared, the city visible through the window, and watched Maris work at the kitchen table with the focused energy she brought to things she cared about. She was revising the expansion proposal for the initiative's 8th city. Her laptop was open. Her coffee was going cold beside her the way it always did when she was deep in something. She was humming the same quiet, half-conscious melody he'd first noticed 7 weeks after the gala in the back of a car after an evening that had started to change everything. She didn't know she was doing it. He knew the way he'd learned all her small true things, the way she tilted her head when she was genuinely uncertain, the way her laugh arrived quietly before it arrived loudly, the precise moment she decided something, and the slight shift in her posture that marked the decision. 3 years of watching, 1 year of being seen in return. He brought her a fresh cup of coffee and set it beside the cold one without comment, and she looked up and smiled at him with the full, unguarded warmth that she no longer needed to manage, and then returned to her work. He sat on the couch and picked up the book he'd been working through for a week, and the apartment held them both in its ordinary quiet, and outside the city moved through its evening, the way it always had 10,000 lights, 10,000 lives, the same skyline that had always looked like something from this altitude. It looked like enough. It looked like more than enough. It looked finally and fully and without qualification like home.